Okay, so let's start with the case study on Uber. And this is by FaberNovel. And essentially, this case study, however, requires that you would first go through the Gaffonomics season 1 and season 2 because this is a continuation of the same. And you are expected to know the basic concepts that were already discussed in that particular case study. Now, this particular case study about Uber is subtitled The Transportation Virus. Now, that doesn't obviously mean that Uber is a virus. The idea is that, like a virus, Uber has spread across the globe at an exponential rate. And that's exactly what this case study is all about. Now, this is related to the concept of the unicorns that was discussed in Gaffonomics' case studies, which basically talks about these newer companies, these smaller, newer companies that have just propped up and are basically making use of the networked economy created by the four giants, which, in my opinion, also includes Microsoft. So that's the five of them, which is Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. So, all of these together have created such a strong network economy that these smaller new companies such as Uber and Kareem and several others have actually cropped up and actually are making use of those networks, of those platforms, and are growing at a much rapid rate than those five giants did in their own times. So let's look at how that has happened. Now, in order to understand Uber, we first need to look at the statistics that make Uber. So Uber has was born in 2009, and it, as of today, which is around about this case study was released in the early part of this year, which is 2016. So the statistics probably belong to the end of 2015. Anyways, so it was born in 2009, and 3 million trips per day are taken every day. So this is equivalent to about 80 trips to the moon every day, the amount of distance covered, that is. And it amounts to $10 billion of bookings in 2015 alone. 1 million drivers are part of the Uber worldwide platform. This is all across the globe. And they reach about 1 billion rides in total. Since 2010 to now, they've already reached about 1 billion rides across the globe. All of these statistics are taken from The Verge and the Reuters article about, and also in Washington Post and several other news agencies posted about this. Anyways, so that's the basic statistics out of the way. So it's eating the world one city after the other. What does that mean? It means it's expanding gradually across the globe. Uber is already available in about 470 cities across the 70 countries, and it's constantly competing with several local transportation actors, be it Kareem in Pakistan, be it the regular taxi services, be it the metro services, several other cab services across the globe. And yet it is competing and being quite successful as compared to many of the local solutions for the same. Now, in China, it has its largest market in China, with one third of all total rides of Uber are actually just in China, and that is a huge achievement because if you're able to capture the largest market with the largest population, the rest is just, well, a piece of cake. So, anyways, if you were to look at the statistics, it says in London, UK, of the total 35,000 of taxi services, 15,000 of them are Uber drivers, while only 20,000 are taxis, the regular taxis. And that is a huge achievement. Imagine that. You have just dominated one of the most oldest cities, the oldest cities in the world, and with one of the most largest urban area coverage and transportation requirements in the world. So that's a huge achievement, and being able to capture it as opposed to the regular taxi services is again quite an achievement. So it's the fastest metabolism so far. What do we mean by that? By that we mean that unlike the earlier companies, the bigger giants, the 4 or 5 giants I talked about earlier, which is Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, this company has actually grown to a billion much faster. What do I mean? Why is that significant? This is significant because if you look at the absolute old giants, if you look at IBM, if you look at Bell Labs, you look at AT&T, all of these companies took a longer time. You go back further, you'll go to Coke and Pepsi, took even longer. You come forward, you talk about companies like Apple and Microsoft, they took about 20, 30 years. You look at Google and Facebook and the relatively modern ones, and you'll see that the time is reduced. But if you look at how Uber's done it and how Tesla's done it. So this graph on slide number 6 actually shows you just that. that the number of years has dropped over time. So a typical Fortune 500 company took over 20 years, which is what I was talking about when I was saying Apple and Microsoft, took over 20 years to reach a market capitalization of a billion. Google took about 8 years. Facebook took about 4.5, 5 years. Tesla took about 4 years. Uber, on the other hand, was able to do this in about 2.5 or about 2.25 years. That's amazing. And if you compare it to the rest, Uber is at 68 billion, while Xiaomi, which is the a Chinese company, headed by Hugo Barra, who earlier used to be a Googler, is at 46 billion, while Airbnb, which is again another unicorn company, because it is one of those companies that actually grew up because of the networks already created by the giants, has a market capitalization of 25.5 billion. So Uber is one of the most valued startups in the world. Uber reached a 50 billion valuation in just 5 years, with 1.5 billion in revenue at that very time. That's a huge achievement. If you remember the statistics for Google, or try and recall the statistics for Facebook, not even those reach that point. So, along with Facebook, it is the only startup to have reached this level of evaluation. You know, that's a major achievement. So, Uber's valuation is the largest for any private startup in the world. That's because Uber raised about $14 billion over 16 different rounds of raising their investments over the last 7 years, which includes banks such as Goldman Sachs, includes venture capitalists such as Benchmark and Fidelity. It even includes tech giants such as Google itself and Baidu, which is China's search engine. It is basically China's Google. So, and tech stars like Amazon itself. So that's quite an achievement if you think about it right there. So obviously, this kind of growth is going to be seen by a lot of other companies, but that's exactly why we're studying Uber, because this company has proven itself in that way. So growing higher than historical actors. Again, the same comparison goes on. Now it's going to compare it Uber to General Motors. Let's look at that. The market capitalization and valuation of General Motors as opposed to Uber. In less than 7 years of existence, Uber has already surpassed the valuation of a 108-year-old car company, which is General Motors. So in just 7 years, Uber has a larger market capitalization as opposed to General Motors. Imagine that. Uber has over 68 billion US dollars worth of market capitalization, while General Motors, which is over 108 years old, is only at 45 billion. So Uber is worth more than 85% of Standard and Poor's 500 companies. Standard and Poor's is, by the way, the standardization and the ranking for the top level companies in the world. It's a standard giving or a ratings organization. So that's a huge achievement. 85% of those companies are not as highly worth as Uber. So valued at 6 times more than the size of the taxi and the limo market in the US before Uber even entered the market. Okay, so that's again huge achievement. Now let's compare to the number of employees. Now one would think that the number of employees would be just as large. Not really. Uber only has 6,700 employees that are actually employed by Uber, while General Motor has over 215,000 employees. And if the number of drivers that actually they have is a million. So General Motors has 32 times more employees than Uber, despite a lower valuation. One would think if you have enough, employees, you would probably be earning just as much, but that's not the case. So despite having less people, Uber makes more money. And despite having more people, General Motor makes less money. So it's not about the number of people you have. It's not a production oriented economy anymore. So how exactly is it doing it? You're on slide number 8, by the way. So how exactly is it doing it? What are these secrets that this young giant company actually has that it's been able to do this? So how did it grow so fast? That's what we're here to look at. So let's start focusing on that. So Uber is basically a transportation virus, and the entire case is going to model itself based on exactly that hypothesis. We are going to look at it like it's a virus that grows, like a biological virus, or you could take it a computer virus. It's just an analogy. It's not an actual explanation. So since the very beginning, Uber has behaved like a virus, because if you think about what you would define a virus as, and as Wikipedia defines it as, it's a sub-microscopic infectious agent that replicates only inside the living cells of other organisms. So a virus isn't necessarily something that's actually harmful. It is only defined by its ability to self-replicate. So viruses are not bad things. They're just things that can make copies of themselves and spread really quickly. So in Uber's case, these host organisms are all of these millions of cars that you have all over the globe. So that's why the creators of this case study are talking about Uber like a virus. It has this ability to spread all over the cities, all over the world, like a virus. Okay, so Uber is infecting hundreds of new cars every day by actually making them part of its fleet. And it's taking control of all the transportation of all the metropolis. So that's what a virus does. The first step is synthesize it. The second is seeding the germs. The third is becoming more contagious. The fourth is mutating fast, and five is defending what ground you've held. So let's look at each one of them briefly first, and then we'll go into details each one. So the first step, synthesizing, is identifying a poorly served market and developing a platform to serve it 10 times better. That's what Uber does. That's what any good, sensible company needs to do. You need to do market research. You need to find out which particular market, which particular industry, which particular city, country, continent, area, whatever is not being served, and the problem of transportation is not being solved, and then you attack it. That's what you do. Number two, seeding germs, finding the best environment to incubate under favorable circumstances. Do things that don't scale to kickstart your network and reach liquidity. Okay, very simple. What you do is, you once you've identified which environment, you start creating your business there. Either you acquire some businesses, either you partner with them, either you work with them, you create one altogether, and you try and do things uh, you know um, that can actually increase, that can actually scale itself, so that you can actually be having more liquidity. That's very important. Number three, become contagious. You basically use the leverage of your user base. You actually leverage them. You use whatever number of people who are using your services, and you make more partnership with them to increase your level, to become even more infectious, more contagious, like any virus does. That's what viruses do, right? They actually spread and they make copies. They do that by infecting other things. So that's what you need to do. And in Uber's case, that's what they did too. Mutate fast. You never stop innovating, because if you do, eventually the antibodies, or in our case the competition, will copy your model and actually defeat you. So you need to constantly move, you need to constantly innovate, you need to make up better over time. And number five, of course, once you actually have strength in a place, you have actually taken root, so to speak, you become strong, you need to defend it or consolidate it. So the basic principles that go into how a business is actually run are exactly the same principles that Uber has followed, and that's exactly the kind of steps that a virus goes through. That's why they're using this analogy. So let's start with the first one, which is synthesizer. Identifying a poorly served market and developing a new platform to serve it 10 times better. How did Uber do it? Let's see. So the first thing that they need to do when Uber was doing this is to identify what they refer to as the incompatibility triangle. What's that? Think about it. There are basically three basic ways in which you actually look at any call-in taxi services or apps, or these search apps that actually allow you to call these taxis. However, they have to be balanced between three things. And what are those three things? There's low price, there's reliability of the service, and there's good user interface, right? So hailing a cab is not considered very reliable. Why? Because demand is much higher than the offer. Okay? So that is usually the problem here. Then we have the issue of ordering with the phone. So in many countries, one has to pay for the waiting time. That is also a concern, because if you order a taxi and whatever time you are making it made, or whatever time it will have to wait, you'll have to pay, right? And plus the phone call, you're going to wait and you're going to pay. So that's another problem. It's not convenient. It's not fast enough. Then at the taxi station, there aren't much taxi stations, and one has to walk long distance to even find one. So these three are the problems, and these are the three criteria upon which any good service is going to be hinged upon. It has to be reliable, it has to have a good user interface, and it has to be charging lower prices than the actual regular taxi services. So Uber's founding idea dates back to this conference that they had in 2008 in Paris, called Liveb conference, when the CEO, who's Travis Kalanick, and Garrett Camp, couldn't find a taxi that cold Paris weather. And like any good idea, the idea actually comes from the problem. And the problem was, they couldn't find a damn taxi after the conference. So it was impossible to find a cab to hail, which means to call it, and ordering on the phone was very expensive, because you'll have to sit and hold, and that'd be quite expensive, because you will be like waiting in the line. So after the answering machine just keeps you there, you press this one to do this and press two to do that, and we all know how annoying that can be and how expensive that can be, especially if you're doing it through a cell phone, especially if this is in your home country, and obviously you're doing it from your own number and the roaming charges and everything. Anyways, and they couldn't find any nearby station. So this is why they're like, dude, we need to solve this problem. So there are just three ways to get a taxi, and none of them combines these three elements. If you recall, these are the exact same three basic principles that you also discussed during the Amazon case. Of course, that was a retail industry. This is a services industry. That was about buying stuff online. This is about transportation. But the basic principles are always going to be the same, which is you need to lower the price. Nobody's going to be willing to pay more unless you're giving them something more. So everybody wants lower price, no matter how rich you are. Has to be reliable, similar to the way that they were about how many things were available there, the large variety of things. So obviously it translates to reliability in the transportation case, and obviously good user interface. So compared to that, Amazon was focusing on convenience. So similar to the convenience aspect, you have the good user interface aspect, that the app or whatever platform you're going to use to call such a taxi has to be simple, has to be well designed, has to be functional. So the simple solution are right at the tap of a button. So Uber's core value proposition is just that. It was quite ambitious, yes, but it was just that. Then you tap a button and you get a taxi. So to deliver on this, they created this really well designed app that took this idea of dispatching function out of the black car and traditional taxi market, which is like all you need to do is to have this rider app. You want where you actually say I want to go from this point, and obviously the phone has the location service. You say from this point to this point, and you request a car, and a driver is just sent to you. It's that simple. Okay, and the partner app, that you have is basically the one that the rider has. Is I want to drive someone from point A to point B. Indicate that you're available. Once you receive a request, just pick up your rider, right? So the app had two elements to it. The first element part is the one that you and I use, the one that we as riders will be using, the actual Uber app. And the other half of the app is going to be the one that the drivers who are part of the Uber network will have. So when you actually press a button on the app and say, I want to ride from point A, which is where you are, to some point B, automatically all the cars in the area are going to be notified that if you're willing to drive someone from point A to point B, you will be notified, and that's it. And they'll just say, yes, I'm willing to take this, and then it shows up on the first app. It's that simple. So it was simple, but it was ambitious. But again, isn't that the case with every good idea, right? So improving it with every step of the experience. So the taxi user interface filled with many pain points. So there was a lot of problems in the actual regular services that were present before Uber. I mean, you could either go on the street and just say, ask a taxi to stop, wave your hands around. You need to, or if you were doing it beforehand, you had to pay extra fees for that. The driver will decide whether or not they want to take you or not. Unknown duration. No, you wouldn't know how long the taxi would take to get there. The taxi couldn't be tracked where it was exactly at that point in time. You might want to cancel, you might want to switch, whatever. You couldn't do that earlier. You had to make cash payments. That was necessary in most countries. Still is, but that was a big problem, and there was absolutely zero customer service. On the other hand, let's look at how Uber's user interface solved that. So Uber said every time you want to go from point A to any other point, that you can actually look at the pickup time. You'll actually be able to see on a map, which is similar to Google Maps, and you'll actually see the car actually moving towards you. And how long it will take, it actually estimates the time. You'll actually see it in real time, the car actually moving to you. You can check the driver's ratings, how other people have rated them. If you don't like it, you can always cancel. Okay, and and all of this is done by single click. No extra menus, no jumping around menus and hoops, which is again very annoying because you just want to go. The app shouldn't come in between your work. It should facilitate it. You can actually, as I already said, you can see the driver coming, and the Uber ride is tracked, so you can actually know precisely where they are. Okay, and the records of those precise trip while they're actually coming to you, and when you actually go with them, and when they drop you, is all going to be logged and kept at Uber server. So there's always a security element. If there's any hanky panky, you can always call them up and they'll pull out the records. And the payment's pretty simple. And not only does it mention how much it's going to charge you, depending on the rushed hour or depending on what place you're going, depending the pre-ordering, you can actually pay quite easily. Plus, you can give them ratings, which is different from how it used to go earlier. So if you don't like a driver, you rate them badly, and obviously nobody else is going to be going with that driver again. eventually over time. So that's a good thing. You can rate them according to their services. Now, this has already been mentioned, but I'm going to go into details now, obviously, is the fact that, and we are on slide 14, by the way, is the fact that Uber has actually gained this ground. Uber has become this powerful and this important, not just because it is a good company, but because it has made absolutely amazing use of the infrastructure already laid down by the GAFA-nomic companies. And I include Microsoft in it, so I would say GAFAM. So it's Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. How so? Think about it. Uber has actually created this service right on top of all the stuff that has already been created by these other companies. If you look at it, it accesses all of its users through what? An app. You use Uber using an app. Where do you find the app? The app is on the Google Store. The app is on the Apple Store. The app is on the Amazon Store, right? The app is on the Facebook App Store. That's how you do it. You can actually do it through Amazon's Echo now, which is basically Amazon's AI based service, similar to Google Home, and you can do it through Facebook's Messenger, which is of course Facebook's chat application. Those are the touch points, and all of them don't belong to Uber, do they? You actually are accessing it through all of these GAFA people, right? On the other hand, let's look at payments. How do you usually pay to Uber? You can do it by cash, or you've got several other options. So, other than the access to the users, the second thing that Uber actually utilizes from the GAFAM nomics infrastructure is the payment platform. Now, usually we pay from either cash in Pakistan, for Uber or for Kareem or for any of these services, we pay through cash. But there are several other options. Most specifically, the ones that are most common across the globe are Google Wallet, or as it now known as Android Pay, and Apple Pay, and even Samsung Pay. So you see that the payment platforms themselves are actually derived from the GAFA infrastructure. Then let's move to the driver navigations. What do we use? Lo and behold, Google's Maps and Waze, which is also a product owned by Google. So you see, in all three cases, the access to the users, the payments, the driver navigation, none of this was actually created by Uber. They were all actually created by these giants that are part of the Gafanomics infrastructure, and that's what Uber is leveraging to use. So now that Uber has actually grown big enough and is slowing growing independence, for example, it started to create and gain a lot of data from Google Maps and from Jakarta and Bing Maps, and is trying to actually have that data on its own. But in the beginning, its growth was all based on all of these platforms, and that's the future. That's where you'll see Airbnb and several other similar companies actually building upon, and that's what was discussed in the Gafanomics case study, where these smaller companies will actually be using it, but using the infrastructure created by the Gafa to become strong and actually become popular and have their own individual platforms. So let's move on now from this particular slide, which is slide number 14, to the next one. Now, the next one is about the MVP insight: smartphone plus car is equal to connected car. Now, what do we mean by that? What we mean is that leveraging the smartphone sensors, what are the sensors? Almost all cell phones have accelerometers and gyroscopes. Gyroscopes are for left, right, up, and down movements, and is in the z-axis. Accelerometers are specifically designed to gain and gauge speed and direction and navigation. Plus, of course, there is the GPSs. Okay, so leveraging these sensors, Uber is able to know precisely where a particular car is and where a particular user is. So that's exactly why this particular cell phone is the actual reason why they've been able to come to the point where they have. So it's an asset light model. You see, you don't need to buy a lot of stuff. Uber has become a major part of this car market by just simply attaching the smartphone to this fleet of cars. They didn't need to invest a lot of money in creating anything. So they didn't need to actually do it by having a lot of cars and a lot of infrastructure, and then running their fleets of cars and then having some kind of trackers. They didn't need any of that. So people already had cell phones which they used to connect well to the rest of the world. They needed was just a car, which of course are all of the people who are using Uber's services, either by giving their cars as services or actually being riders. So combining that together, you have a connected car, whether it be the rider or the user. So This has already been highlighted by Mark Anderson and Venkatesh Rao in the Gaffinomics case, right? That's what he said. In a network world, the three most important things are connections, 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 and that's exactly what has been happening, and that's what will continue to happen. Now, Uber is actually a real-time transportation network. How so? Uber has actually created this huge network of real time, and when I say real time, that means you're actually getting data right now. It's not going to be sent like 5 minutes now, or second, or a couple of weeks from now, or a month from now, knowing where they are. No, you open it up there in their network, you will know where exactly each of the riders is right now. So this real time network of geolocated riders and drivers, which is commonly called a platform, and it gives this network access to everyone who's using an app, and it is able to find the right kind of cars in the right place for the right amount of people. So if you look at this chart, on slide number 16, this graph, it has the information, the rider, the driver, the device, and the Uber brain. So it's just a network. That's essentially what it is. That's the real power. So networking and networks of these platforms is the future. That's what we talked about in Gaffinomics season 2. That's what they said, that this did, that looking at Google or Amazon or Facebook or Apple, and you'll see all four of their diagrams right here. This is the core of their success, and this is the core of the success of the companies that are building themselves upon, on these four giants. Compare this to how these earlier traditional companies did, and you will notice that the earlier companies did not earn as much money as compared to these. So network orchestrators outperform these traditional companies, and you can look at it right there. You can look at the fact that Ford has 8.4% of average revenue compound annual growth rate from 2011 to 2012. Accenture, which is a service provider, 6.3%. IBM, which is technology creator, 12.2%. But Uber, 17.2%, right there. This is from Harvard Business Review. So, unlocking the four superpowers. We talked about the four different superpowers that any particular business that needs to strengthen itself and become strong in this modern era of the Gaffinomics needs to do. And these four superpowers were referred to as being a magnet enterprise, being a real time enterprise, being an infinite enterprise, and being an intimate enterprise. The magnet enterprise referring to the fact that they'll aggregate a lot of things that they have and bring them together to create value. Real time enterprise in the sense that they will use real time data and feedback and consumer behavior analytics. Infinite enterprise in the sense that they will constantly talk about 100% profit consumers. Okay, be scalable, be able to grow, and intimate enterprise in the sense that they would focus specifically on mass customization, of focusing on a consumer, on every individual consumer, by basically making it appear as if every single product is tailored for them, which is not exactly what's happening, but this is how the place is structured. The same way that Google personalized search works. It's a personalized thing. It's specifically tailored to you. Like every cell phone, be it Android or Apple, is specifically tailored to you because you make it yours by installing all the apps that you do. They provide the platform, you make it yours. That is the key of any successful business in this day and age. Okay. So moving on, let's talk about each one of these, each one of these superpowers and how Uber actually incorporates each one of these superpowers. Let's start with magnet enterprise, which is managing cars excess capacity. How does Uber actually do that? So in the US, cars remain idle. They're like standing there waiting for over 96% of the time. So Uber basically could have actually decided to have bought a lot of these cars and become a black car service, basically like a rent a car service. But instead of doing that, it structured itself as a platform to aggregate, sell, and monetize this excess capacity. I mean, think about it. They could have just gone and said, "Chalo yaar, theek hai, hum koi 100, 200, 1000, 2000 lakh, 2 lakh गाड़ियां खरीदते हैं, and that's it. And we will just use these cars and be a rent a car service." No, they said, agar 96% of the time the cars are standing there, why not give them an opportunity? Why not just utilize and leverage that and ask people to use their cars as a rent a car service, and be connected to their system? So this is a very similar approach to Airbnb's approach to accommodation and to actually rent a place. Or which, by the way, Airbnb is a company that is also part of this new revolution, which is building itself on the infrastructure created by the GAFA. If you recall, Airbnb is air, bed and breakfast, right? B&B stands for that. So you see, they don't own a single place that they actually give out for rent. You know, They are exactly like that. Places that essentially they've built a platform to facilitate payments and reviews and search for all of these micro entrepreneurs who actually use these their services to actually rent out places. That's it. They are the world's largest real estate company that doesn't own a single patch of land. So anyways, so think about it. Uber actually works in this way. You pay for the ride, and Uber gives 80% of the fares to the car providers and matches the riders with the drivers and keeps 20% of the service as fees. And the people who are providing their cars for Uber services are providing the rides. So you essentially are making quite a lot of money by actually using Uber's platform if you are a person who has a car that is 96% idle. It's a win-win. So Magnet Enterprise continued. So turning riders into managers. So trust and safety are of course a major part. So you can't be willing to be riding in a stranger's car a few years ago, could you? But think about it. You already do that with taxis. We trust taxi drivers all the time. So that's exactly what Uber said. They said, let's have a rating system. And by the way, the rating system is not new. Amazon used it. eBay used it. So all they did was put this rating system into their particular system. And every time you use a particular car service, you just rate the driver to drive well or don't. How so? Uber created a feedback loop by asking riders to drive and riders to rate each other after each ride. So drivers with an average of 4.6 uh, out of a 5-star rating will obviously be denied to the platform, and that's a very strict rule. Think about it, that's about 90% or so. So that's pretty strict. So Uber doesn't hold reputation, the drivers have to. Uber doesn't have to worry about it. Uber doesn't even need to fire the drivers or hire them. They'll automatically drop out if they don't maintain this 4.6% rating. And the customer is obviously king. Most of these extra services that are provided by drivers are not mandatory. Think about it. If a driver has decided to give extra free water bottles, or or if they're wearing a nice suit while driving the car, or if they're giving any kind of extra incentives, the drivers do it themselves. The drivers are doing it just to get a good rating. Again, Uber doesn't have to worry about the costs involved in that. Then let's move to the real-time enterprise. So it's always priced at the optimum. Okay, and what do we mean by that? Uber leverages data that it's collecting in real time to make sure that the demand and offer are always in a match. Think about it. If there's a lot of traffic on the road and you're taking an Uber car, obviously they're going to charge you more. They're going to charge you accordingly, and they're going to gather data and make sure that compared to the local transportation offers, the users price elasticity, you're going to price accordingly. So pricing is pretty tough challenge for Uber. Drivers want to make sure that they make more money, and riders want to minimize their cost. That's pretty sensible, right? So that's how it is. That's how they will actually be doing it. So if that is the case, then how will they balance this particular equilibrium? So let's see how Uber does it. Uber fixes the prices in each city based on local data that it's already collected. Whenever it can, Uber lowers the price to trigger an increase in demand and decreases drivers' idle time. So when it decreases the price, obviously more people will use it, and obviously the drivers have less idle time, thus maintaining the driver's overall hourly rate. In some cities, it cuts the prices 5 to 6 times in a 3 year period. So that will keep the balance right there, adapting to supply and demand in real time. With surge pricing, Uber increases the price in given areas during excessive demand or low supply. And when would that be? Provides an incentive for drivers to flock to empty neighborhoods. I mean, think about it. If a lot of people want to travel and there are only a handful of drivers, they'll charge more, right? So while cabs don't know where the demand is higher, the regular cabs don't know, but Uber can actually guide its drivers to those places. They can actually recommend that this is a rider waiting to be taken up, and the driver will obviously charge more because there are no cabs right there. It maintains low pickup time and high utilization in case of market stress. So more people, and if there are more people that want to actually in a particular area, they want to ride, and obviously they want to ride quickly. That's what Uber does. So it reduces the time it takes for the cab to reach them, the Uber cab to reach them, and therefore the high utilization means that automatically they can charge more. And that again is happening because they have real time data. Surge pricing eliminates 2/3 of the unfulfilled request in a period of high demand. So by charging more, they are going to actually send the cars more often because the drivers will be interested to go there, and they will be able to fulfill the requests even though there is a lot of high demand, because a lot of drivers will want to actually earn more money. So that's another way that Uber does it right. So moving on, let's see how we actually do this, which is the next step. Next, we're going to talk about furthermore about real-time enterprise and how they actually use data-driven optimizations for several other things. Let's list with an actual example. So it says that having thousands of cars is not enough. You need to make sure that the right car is there at the right time. While traditional taxis have to wait in line expecting customer to actually show up at a taxi station, Uber can actually use this geolocation features of a phone to identify where a particular rider is requesting a ride and where they need to actually send it. So based on this, based on its very powerful dispatch algorithm, which actually makes sure that it sends the right amount of Uber taxis at the right places based on the demand, it is able to optimize this car allocation. Okay, which is essentially, if you would have recall in your operational research courses and in operations management courses, you have studied what is referred to as a newsboy problem and the queuing problem. This is, and even the network queuing problem. This is exactly the solution for it. This is exactly the greatest possible usage of those things. So that's what it's done. So it optimizes the car allocation to minimize the driver's idle time. Driver doesn't have to sit there waiting for a possible rider, and the rider's waiting time, by where they don't have to stand there waiting for a possible taxi. It matches them according to the data available. Reliability is actually the key, and that's exactly, if you recall again, basic objective, the basic mission of Uber: a car at the tap of a button. So Uber dispatches one trip every second in London, optimizing pickups in real time. In major cities, the average pickup time is around 3 minutes, which is not a lot at all. Think about it. We've already stood for more than 3 minutes waiting for the taxi, and even then, the most of the riders are not most of the drivers are not interested in going where they want to, or we haggle over the cost that we will be willing to pay. While in the case of Uber, that's already decided. They actually are showing up because they are willing to take you, and you are willing to go with them because they've already shown the actual amount that you'll be paying. So everyone's happy. There's a very little time wasted. So a strong differentiation from data blind legacy taxi system, which close to 60% of San Francisco taxis are dispatched in more than 10 minutes. So in larger cities, there are actually taxi companies, and it takes them over 10 minutes. If you make a phone call to them, it takes them over 10 minutes to actually send you a taxi. And that again is hugely, wasteful of resources. Let's look at how Uber is an intimate enterprise. So this is the third superpower, by the way. So it diversifies to adapt to users' needs. Now, Uber constantly adapts the services to make sure that it's focusing on all of its different kinds of customers. You need to understand that it's not going to be just youngsters riding to the universities or just people going to work. It's going to be all sorts of people, all with all sorts of different needs. And that's something that we need to understand, and something that this company actually understands. So for some of them, it'll be based on price is an issue. For some of them, it's the reliability. For some of them, it's the less prices and more about the premium experience. So they need to cater for all of them. So say, let's take these three examples that are in the case. There's this guy named Carl who's 24 years old. He's a student, so he's price sensitive. Obviously, he likes to go out a lot, but he's price sensitive. So Uber X occasionally, and Uber Pool at night. Now Uber X is of course their actual car taxi service, and Uber Pool is their ride along with other people. It's carpooling service, where one car would be passing by a particular area and a lot of people would get on it, and they would share the cost instead of having each person going in a separate car and paying higher. So it's like Tripda, if you've looked it up. Anyways, so he actually prefers that. So he actually uses UberX on a regular basis and uses Uber Pool at night on weekends when he's actually going out with friends or having fun. So Lauren and Tim are a couple which are 45 years old roughly, and they are time sensitive entrepreneurs because they are time sensitive and experience sensitive and have two children. So they prefer to have Uber Black for occasional usage, which is the premium car line service, and Uber Berline for professional rides on their business profiles. So when they're actually traveling for business, they prefer to use Uber Berline. When they are traveling for their occasional usage, they have a separate one, which is the Uber Black, which is designed to have better experience. Family profiles, profiles to pay for their children's rides on Sundays. So they have these separate profiles where they actually are going to be using Uber for separate purposes. They're the same people, but using it for separate purposes. So when they're traveling personally, they use it for a separate service of Uber's various taxi lines. So you've got the most premium cars, you've got the more equipped cars with internet services and all, and for the children, specific special request cars. Anyways, then the third example, which is of a doctor who's again price sensitive and lives far from public transport, so he needs a car and he needs it in an emergency. So this person uses Uber Commute to go to work on a daily basis. So he uses a pricing service system where he actually is going to be using it on a daily basis because he needs to go to work every day because there are no public transports there. Again, price sensitive and time sensitive even. So you see, based on all of these, we only know about just Uber. We don't look at the fact that every individual has a different need, and accordingly Uber is handling those needs. This is extremely important for any good company to understand. You are doing essentially what is referred to as mass customization, tailoring your product and your service and your platform according to the customer's needs. Very important. So it's about handling different market segments, and in this case it's not every individual is kind of like a separate market segment. Yes, you can cluster them together, but the idea is they each have their special needs, and you're going to allow them to have different varieties right there. So adapting to local specificities, you know, sorry about that. It's a tongue twister. Okay, so what do I mean by this? By that, we mean we need to understand that Uber is not just operating in the US or just in Europe. It's actually operating all across the globe. So you need to look at the different problems and the different opportunities in each of these countries, and you need to tailor accordingly. This is referred to as localization and regionalization. So Uber is in more than 70 countries. Each market has its own specifications and its expectations and restrictions and even preoccupations and the taxes and the legal mumbo jumbo. And there's a lot of difficulties. So Uber doesn't hesitate from changing. And that's very important. If a company doesn't understand that it needs to change itself based on the market that it's trying to operate in, it will never be really successful. So they need to change it, they need to enrich it, they need to become more personalized to make sure that they can actually capture these markets. So adapting, think about it. The way that Uber works in India, in Egypt, and in Pakistan, they offer payment services using cash because they know these are the kind of countries that do not trust electronic methods of payments such as Android Pay or Apple Pay or even Samsung Pay because of several security reasons. And these people would prefer much rather to pay in cash. So we are one of those countries who prefer to pay with cash. So they adapted their payment systems to have cash, cash payment systems as being acceptable. On the other hand, if you look at how things work, even in our country, they have separate types of vehicles. So they launched Uber Moto in towns where two-wheelers are the preferred means of transportation. So they've actually done that in Thailand and India and Indonesia. They actually have gotten Uber Moto, which actually uses motorcycles and rickshaws, or and again in our country they've already launched their rickshaw service, which is again under the same rule. So they also have Uber Green in eco-conscious countries such as Portugal and Uber Boat in Istanbul to cross the Bosphorus sea. Why? They're doing that because they understand that each one of these countries are also interested in different kinds of vehicles because each one of them has different needs. That's why it makes more sense. That's exactly. I mean, people would much and people mocked and joked about the fact that Uber rickshaw makes no sense. But you see, it's part of the overall strategy. It's part of the approach. They've already tested this. They're not idiots. They've tested it in other third world countries who've already, gotten accustomed to it. A lot of people are like, why would people actually wait for it? You can easily find a rickshaw. Think about it. Right now, you can actually find a rickshaw where the trust is a huge factor. We already know the kind of scams and the kind of mugging that happens because of rickshaws. Lots of problems. Plus, many cases those rickshaw people do not actually charge you accordingly. They actually charge you higher. Or you could be in a region where getting a rickshaw is actually hard. But think about the fact that you will be able to match the riders and the drivers and match their consent to actually be willing to go at a particular fare at a particular location accordingly. And that's where Uber helps. That's where if it has already worked in Thailand, which is also a country similar to our problems, and in India and in Indonesia and even in places like Portugal and in Istanbul, for boats, for the love of God, think about it, boats, Uber boats. And obviously it can work even in Pakistan with respect to rickshaws. Now we'll see, maybe, but from the statistics it can clearly be seen it will probably work out. Now, developing extra services in India, passenger safety is a real concern. We already know about a lot of harassment problems and cases and in India, so it's a huge problem. So they also have in-app SOS button. This button automatically sends trip information to all of the relatives and locals who you have added on your list, so that they can immediately inform the police authorities if there's any hanky panky going on. If a particular rickshaw is taking you in the wrong direction, if there is a possible mugging that's going to happen, if there's a possible kidnapping or an harassment that is about to happen, it'll immediately call all of them. So it can also directly call India's emergency numbers that were specifically designed for this. You see, so they already have thought about these problems. Now, these problems may not be that common in a first world country, but in a country like Pakistan or India, it is fairly common. So let's move to the fourth or superpower, which is infinite enterprise. Sorry, the third superpower now, the infinite enterprise. So correction again. The fourth superpower again, infinite enterprise, scaling at zero marginal cost. Scaling is basically referred to as increasing your size, expanding without having to inherently and intrinsically change your actual infrastructure. So being highly scalable requires that you have built your structure in a manner that can easily increase without adding any extra costs. That is, of course, very difficult to do, but in the era of networked companies, in the era of gaffinomic based companies, this can be done. So Uber uses highly scalable software and service to achieve the zero cost delivery. So once you already have a certain number of users, critical mass. What do I mean by that? You have sufficient number of drivers and a certain number of riders, the growth is just going to go higher from that point onwards. So it doesn't own any of the cars dispatches, already is going to cut down cost right there. So you don't own any of the cars that most of these taxi companies have to. And in addition to this, they already have automatized all the steps of the taxi experience apart from the ride itself. So other than just riding the taxi by you, there's nothing that needs to be done anymore. Uber doesn't need to own anything. So Uber can scale and grow as much as it wants indefinitely. The software platform's right there. The hardware platform's already there. The infrastructure's there. The app is working. That's it. They don't need to build a new office. They don't need to buy any more new cars. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to virtually do any kind of expenditure to actually keep on expanding. So that's essentially scaling with zero marginal cost. There's not a single penny you need to spend to increase the number of people you are going to be able to cater for. So as long as there are more drivers joining in, and as long as there are riders who wish to go, Uber continues to expand. So close to full automation. So order and pick up. The request ride at GPS location, pick up rider at GPS location. Right. With and during the ride, the ride information is happening, and the tracking is already happening. Payment, the payment seamless. Either you're going to pay by cash, or if you use any of the electronic means, whether it be Android Pay or Apple Pay or Samsung Pay or Ali Pay or any other payment systems, there's nothing required. So is the ride shareable? Yes, even that is shareable. So it is already automated through the app, and the customer service again automated through the app. Even if you're paying it through any electronic means, it's already automated. So the only thing that's not automated is the ride itself, and there's nothing we can do about that, obviously. Other than that, everything's on the app, and there's nothing you need to spend anymore. Compare this to the old and then way of doing things. G7 was this old service which actually had 8,000 drivers in Paris. So it had 270 phone operators to dispatch those cars. People picking up the phone and say, okay, yahan pe gaadi hai, yahan jao, pick up that rider there, pick up that rider there. So 8,000 drivers in Paris alone. So one operator for 30 drivers. Compare this to Uber, 1 million drivers worldwide and less than 100 phone operators. So if the booking process hadn't been automated, Uber would have needed to have hired 33,000 phone operators, which would have been 5 times the total global staff. Think about that. Agar aaj Uber would have been doing it in the same way that the older companies used to do it, with physical operators handling the request, it would be forever. Think of it in the same way. Think of it in the way that we actually do our banking, online. That's a good analogy right there. Or the fact that you and I access the Play Store or the Apple Store to get an app. Earlier on, we would need to go to a cell phone shop and actually ask them to put in a particular software. Imagine that. Imagine having to do that every single time you needed an app. It would practically be pointless to have a cell phone. That's the best analogy there. And you've seen how quickly that particular platform has grown. It has just exploded. That's exactly what Uber's doing. That's exactly how Uber has been able to build it up. All of that is being happening through the app. You don't need to have people involved in just picking up a phone call and telling the driver, okay, rider yahan par hai, go and pick the rider, while telling the rider, please wait, it's going to take 15 more minutes. Pointless. You don't need to do that. the software and the structure of the platform already handles it, and there's no need to spend any more money. All they would probably need to spend on is more servers to be able to handle the app, and that is it, nothing else. So that makes it all the more useful. Now, moving on. So let's look further. Infinite enterprise. Now it talks about network effects. I've already mentioned the network effect, law, which is very famous. It's called the Metcalfe's law. METCALF, Metcalfe's law. It's extremely important. It's been applied in several places, and it's pretty simple. Basically, it talks about the fact that for any network to be useful, it needs to have a certain number of users and providers of that service, which means it's n square. It's also mentioned in your e-commerce book. So it talks about, it takes the example of telephones. One telephone in the world is useless. When two people have it, they can talk to each other. The utility of such a system is n square, where n represents a number of users, so on and so forth. So thanks to the network structure of this entire platform, Uber benefits from the network effects. And when it reaches a certain critical mass, a network effect occurs when a product or a service becomes more valuable to its users as more people use it. So the more people use it, the more useful it becomes. The more people actually gain, start becoming drivers, and the more drivers gain in, the more riders want to ride. So all of this actually leads to more exponential growth by Uber and raises the barriers to entry for anyone else trying to replicate their business. That is the actual barrier to entry. You don't create barriers to entry by just making better products. You make it by actually having a stronger user base that is self-fulfilling, that is self-feeding itself. So if you look at the diagram here on slide number 26, that's exactly what it is. So lower prices make Uber, let's start with this. More demand means better opportunities for aspiring drivers, thus increases in offer. So the more the drivers add up, the more drivers means there are more cars in the streets, thus more coverage. The more coverage means there's be less distance between a car and a potential rider, thus faster pickups. More geographical coverage means more saturation, where more cars are available, so less driver downtime. So the more faster pickups leads to faster pickups, make Uber even more reliable, which leads to more driver downtime. Less driver downtime means Uber can lower the price per ride while maintaining stable hourly rates for drivers, right? So less people have to wait, and the drivers get assigned to riders, and they can now lower the prices because there are lots of drivers available, and they'll all get a lot of money because they'll get a chance to take a lot of riders eventually, and this will lower prices, and lower prices will make Uber more attractive and will increase more demand, and then it continues to fuel itself. So you see, it's an extremely powerful value loop. It feeds itself, constantly feeds itself. It keeps on increasing. Recall again, this is exactly the basic idea that Amazon has used. This is the exact same idea that Facebook has used. This is the exact same idea that Google has used. You will never see a company that is succeeding in this day and age, in this network era, without understanding and recognizing this self-fulfilling value loop of network effects, without understanding this need to actually fuel their infrastructure with better service providers, which will lead to more number of customers, which will eventually lead to more service providers, and so on and so forth. That is the key in this new infrastructured world of cafenomics. So this is how they've solved this problem of low price, reliability, and good user interface at three corners of a triangle. This incompatibility triangle has just been solved by creating a connected network of drivers and riders. Uber has already changed the way the personal transportation works by making it a rider at a tap of a button and makes it real. So thanks to its infrastructural and network approach, has been able to benefit from all four superpowers and has actually used this. And what are those four superpowers? Let's revise them again. By leveraging excess capacities, Uber makes sure that the prices are lower. By leveraging real-time data, it's able to be reliable and send the right number of riders at the right places at the right time. By making a service more tailored to each of the users, it makes the experience even better. And by automatizing their entire process, Uber makes sure that the prices are kept low, plus the network effect keeps on increasing the number of the demand while decreasing the prices and increasing the reliability. So let's look at the second part of it, which is seed germs. Once you have actually created the idea, you need to seed the germs to make it even stronger. So find the best environment for Uber and start beginning your work there. Start incubating there. Do things that don't scale to kickstart your network and reach that liquidity. Those things that do not scale up, as you become bigger, you need to start making changes there so that you can actually earn profit. So let's start focusing on that. So Uber has already spread locally as well as globally. Okay, let's look at how it's done that. So let's discuss Uber further on. Now we're on the slide number 29. Uber has already spread locally as well as globally. Okay. And if you think about it, the transportation behemoth is now all over the place. I mean, it is in over 470 cities in 70 countries across the globe. And using a city by city approach instead of actually going all the way, it takes a city by city approach. It has created this huge network of drivers and riders from 2010 onwards. And if you were to break it down, Uber opens in a new city every 5 days in 8 hours. If you were to divide it, so being local and speaking with a local voice is extremely important when you're doing the transportation business. That's something that the CEO has always said. Okay. And if you were to see the breakdown of drivers and riders, it is pretty well done across the globe. Okay. It's extremely well done. Anyways, and even the spread across the entire globe is pretty, well spread out. This is again slide 29. So Gafanomics is all about the first settler advantage, not the first mover advantage, not the follower advantage, but the first settler advantage. And what do we mean by that? In a network world, the markets are actually concentrate around one monopoly on one particular platform. So the winning platform is not the first mover, but the first settler, the first that reaches liquidity is what we are referring to here. So it's not the first mover or the follower, but rather the first settler, the first that reaches liquidity, a state where there is enough volume of supply and demand for transaction to start sparking. In other words, reaching the critical mass. If you were to look at from the perspective of the Metcalfe's law and the network, model, it is basically talking about reaching a state where there are sufficient, service providers and service receivers that it would then exponentially grow from that point onwards. The critical mass, that's where the settler, first settler advantage comes in. So in Uber's case, it means having enough drivers and riders to have this particular ride at the tap of a button for both of them, from the driver's perspective and from as well as from the rider's perspective. So liquidity isn't the most important thing; it's the only thing that you need to focus on. This was said by Simon Rothman from Greylock Partners, which is probably a venture capitalist. So the first settlers always win. We look at the first movers. Lyft was the first mover in this industry, in this caller taxi app industry. But it was Uber that became the first settler. Yahoo was the first mover in the search engine industry, but the first settler, the one that reached the critical mass first, was Google. VRBO was the first in the real estate, providing services industry through apps. But it was Airbnb which became the first settler. The same goes for first mover in MySpace, and the first settler was obviously Facebook. Now, liquidity first, profits later. Market share first, revenue later. Remember, we've always been trying to discuss the same fact that you need to strengthen your market capitalization. You need to be able to have a large number of people using your application, and then from then onwards you can expand, you can actually leverage that to your advantage. It is not about earning money in the beginning. It is not about earning money straight away. That would be very very tempting to think that oh boy, if the company is making a lot of money, it should be good. But that is not the long term goal. That should never be the long term goal. The long term goal has to be to focus on liquidity. The long term goal should be to focus on market share. That is the key. So in every market it enters, Uber is trying to build this liquidity to benefit from this first settler advantage that we just talked about, where you reach this critical mass. It's all about using abundant funding to absorb as much of the high operating cost as is possible, to aggressively build this initial demand and this initial supply. So spending as much resources as we can to build the right kind of platform, the right kind of traction for having people use this service as drivers as well as riders. So once you reach that, the network effect starts kicking off of the Metcalfe's law of the critical mass, and then it actually annihilates the competition, because you will grow at a rate that is so exponential that no other organization, no other company, no other competitor can hope to rival you, because by the time they do, you've already moved ahead, a lot ahead. So Uber's network represents its asset. It uses OpEx to build CapEx. So that's essentially it is. It's operational expenditure to create its capitalization. Anyways, that's what it shows right here. The net revenues on this slide 31 is the net revenues and the operating costs. So you will actually see that Uber's losses was substantial, over 300 million in quarter 4 2014. So Uber's revenues versus their operating costs from 2012 to 2014 is what is being shown in this particular slide, in particular graph. That was quite a bit. So Uber lost a total of over 1.7 billion dollars over the first 3 quarters of 2015 only. It registered a loss of $1 billion for the year 2015 alone, trying to compete in China. And according to its CEO, after the years of loss, the company is now profitable. And if, in several continents, including North America, Australia, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. If you recall, this is exactly the kind of pattern that Amazon was following. They went into losses in the first 7 to 8 years of their lives. Anyways, but moving on. So invest in favorable market conditions. So obviously, it makes sense. You shouldn't be investing in market conditions which are not favorable to becoming the first settler, to approaching liquidity. So make sure that you can reach liquidity easily. So Uber has to be very, very careful, and Uber is very, very careful in the kind of markets and the cities and the countries that it actually selects based on this criteria alone. So in search for this perfect ecosystem of where everything's available. What is that everything? First, it looks at the general data about the city, the size of the city, the suburbs, whether the standards of living, the quality of urban infrastructures, the roads, everything, the presence of accelerants. What do we mean by that? All the stuff that is there. Does the place have bad weather that people would prefer to use taxis? Does the place have a lot of sporting locations that people want to go to, and therefore it's going to attract a lot of people to move around, entertainment and all? Does the place have good restaurants and has a vibrant nightlife, like say the city of Karachi or the city of Lahore? So it makes sense to actually go into a market like that, because obviously it is those kind of places which will attract a lot of customers who wish to move using these services. And the intensity of rivalry. Again, this is essentially the five forces model that we talked about, Porter's five forces model. So the intensity of rivalry, the presence of constrained number of taxis. If the taxi service, the regular taxis there are already overburdened and already are not providing the services that people want, this is where you come in. And how good is the public transport service? Now, if you already have a very good public transport service, like say Dubai, you will obviously not want to go into that market, because people are already going to be having a much better alternative, and they would not probably even bother using you. So an existing demand for Uber also leverages existing data by using this app, opening in unsupported cities to see how people are. I mean, interestingly, a lot of people would install Uber in Karim just to see how it works, even if it is not in their city. So they actually use even that statistic to gauge how much interest they've already developed among people. So that's a major clue right there. I mean, if people are installing the Uber app just to see what it is, it tells you something now, doesn't it? Now, launching with the A team, that's also important. So because it's a multi-local by nature, and by that we mean it's localized but across the globe. So but like in several regions, everywhere, right? So Uber has a horizontal organization that offers a lot of autonomy to every single location's office. Instead of having a centralized control all the way from US, they actually give a lot of autonomy to their offices in different cities and in different countries. So Uber adopts this startup approach when launching in a new town with minor, control from the California headquarters. So it gives every new office that it opens up, every new country it goes into, it takes it like an approach to like they would if they were starting up a whole new company. So for each new city, Uber selects a launcher, whoever's going to be running it and who's going to be launching it there, whose role is to get the business up and running in 8 weeks or less. No more than that, no less. So that's like the kind of approach of a startup. And Uber has already launched this a city in less than 5 days. I mean, even though they give them about 8 weeks, there have been cases where they've launched it in a city in 5 days or less, which is a huge achievement and probably was an impossibility by any of the older behemoth giant companies that we had earlier. So we basically, this is what the Uber's regional general manager for Eastern Europe and Middle East and Africa, Jay Pelanayapa, says. He says, we basically find the top talent in the most relevant communities in that city and give them the opportunity to run their own business. So instead of actually bringing in people from the outside, instead of having the autonomous control from California headquarters, they actually choose the people from the local region because they understand the place better, and they give them autonomy and they give them the kind of resources required and give them the attitude of a startup and ask them to actually create it there. That is an excellent approach, because that's the kind of tactic that would actually give them the kind of attitude they will need later on to compete and to strengthen themselves and consolidate themselves. So they first understand the transportation ecosystem of that place, the relevant regulations, rules, the laws, They build a pricing structure according to the place, obviously, because the pricing is going to change from city to city and country to country. They find the right team and the right office to start it up. The initial supply of drivers, first, of course, you need some drivers to actually begin. It's like the chicken and the egg. You can only, it's going to be like, should we look at for how many people are interested to ride, or should we look at, no, you obviously need to have some drivers available to actually be willing to give the service in the beginning. Identify business development. Why? Because obviously partnership with car operators, maybe entire groups who actually run rent a car services, maybe they could be brought on, maybe other opportunities, some kind of promotional opportunities. Plus they also lay out a marketing strategy to attract the customers, right? In our country, they started in the northern parts of our country first, in Islamabad, Pindi and Lahore. Then they moved to Karachi. They created the right kind of hype because they knew Karachi is a much more bigger market for them. So they waited, they tested themselves out, they worked it out in the northern part of the country, and then they started with the southern, and specifically in Karachi. So building the supply side aggressively, again, very important. Making sure that the number of cars and the drivers available is done properly, is done at a very rapid rate, very quickly. So to be first with this liquidity, to be the first settler advantage, Uber needs to have this supply through various mechanisms. They need to lower the onboard, they need to lower the barriers for the drivers to enter into their system. So what they do is they cannibalize the existing network of drivers. So they get local taxi drivers on, they get a lot of local taxi services on, even competitors. Uber is even believed to have gotten people in from Lyft, and in our country's case they've even hired drivers from Kareem. So they've done that. So they even offer incentives to these new drivers up to $500, which is quite a lot of money, to actually join in with Uber, and we'll talk about that in a while. And attracts drivers with hourly guarantees, because unlike other places and other similar services, Uber actually gives them numbers. They actually show them that every single hour you'll be making up to $30. That's one example, right? So Uber offers about a guaranteed revenue to the drivers. They say you will get the rides. You won't need to just wait. This is not a testing service. We know what we're doing. So drivers turn on the app and they get paid regardless of the number of clients they actually serve. So the drivers immediately get this immediate confirmation that this would work out for them, which is again a huge plus point. So a smart way to maintain the level of supply while building the demand is to actually making sure that the supply doesn't go away. And in Uber's case, obviously that supply is the drivers and their cars. So making sure that they don't run off, making sure that they're available is very important. Lowering the onboarding barriers for drivers. Again, Uber actually forges a lot of partnership with car manufacturers and car resellers as well. So in several countries, they've made a lot of partnerships with Ford and Kia and several other companies, and they actually get a buy and lease and rent cars that they actually also give away to a lot of drivers. So Uber promotes its own vehicle financing programs. What you do is you actually go as a driver and you can actually lease the car from Uber that they already have, and then Uber eventually communicates with these car companies and gets these cars for the drivers. So the drivers will be driving the car and at the same time be paying back for that car. So how does it actually do this? So it also targets innovators to build the demand side. You need to understand that Uber is a new kind of thing. Most people are not used to this kind of thing. So what they do is all of these new technology innovators, people who like to try new technologies quickly, as we already studied about the graph about adoption cycles, customer adoption cycles. The first ones are the innovators, the 2.5%. The early adopters are the 13.5%. The early majority is 34%, while the late majority is 34%, and then the laggards are 16%. So it's this early adopters and it's these innovators that we need to catch on to. Travis Kalanick, the CEO of Uber, says in many cases the importance of the early adopter tech community can be overstated. In many cases, in many of these cases, you'll probably notice people saying, "Oh, early adopters are going to get on more people." You see, in Uber's case, that's not the case. Uber is a tech-oriented product, so the more active these local tech supporting kind of people are, the more they will tell their friends, the more they will actually continue to convince their friends and family to use this, and they'll tell their experience to them, they share their experience to them. That's how those people will actually try Uber. And in the upcoming slides, it'll actually mention the statistic that over 95% of the rides that people actually end up taking through Uber were actually happening because of recommendations coming in from other riders earlier. So now for the third stage, which is becoming contagious. So once you've already gotten that strong base, once you've already become ingrained, you now need to leverage it. You now need to make partnerships to become even more strong and consolidate yourself in that way. So user evangelism is better than TV. Now, understand that most people are not even watching TV anymore. So instead of wasting the money and resources in TV ads and TV spots, Uber says that the network effects are going to catch on if we bring in new users. I mean, you bring in new users, they'll bring in more drivers. The more drivers will get attracted, the more the new users will come in, because the prices will keep on lowering, and more of the beginning, early adopters are going to convince other people. So that's exactly what happens. So Uber actually says that what we do is we accelerate this growth through word of mouth referrals, and we actually pay people. We make it incentivized. How do we do it? Rider to rider referrals. So every time you actually refer it to someone, you send out a code to other people. Your friend takes that ride, uses that code, you actually get some credit. So it's like one of those commission based things. So this referral fee gets transferred to your account that you can use in your next ride. So the more people you refer to use Uber, and the more they use Uber, you actually get to a lot of credit for using Uber, and then the cycle starts again. You use Uber more, right? They do the same thing for drivers. Every time a driver refers another driver to actually join into Uber, they would actually get over $400, and so on and so forth. And they'll keep on convincing more people. So 95%, as I said earlier, 95% of all the riders heard about Uber from other riders. Other people convinced them. So building an ambassadors network. So in some cities, what Uber does is it actually hires these people called brand ambassadors for Uber, right? So what they do is their job is to recruit new drivers. So some of them actually stand at fuel stations. Some of them actually attract them by giving them some free petrol and then signing them up for bonuses, various ways. These ambassadors are on the payroll of Uber. They actually are given a minimum wage, and they make a good money. And every time they actually get a new driver on board, they actually get paid by Uber for that particular driver, and that's like a commission based thing. So you see, instead of actually wasting their money and resources with advertising, them focusing straight onto to the suppliers and to the customers, and they're incentivizing it, and they're spending money on them directly instead of wasting it in the traditional market, in traditional marketing ways. You see, that is smart. Then they also, this is obviously short term, they also focus on the long term. How so? For Uber, a customer is a long-term asset. It's not a one-time thing. It's a long-term lifetime value thing. So Uber profits will actually come in the long term, since they're actually based on how much Uber is able to retain people, how much people are going to come back to Uber and keep on using them. That's where Uber is going to get their money. So in the US alone, Uber is already generating profits ever since 2015. We already know that, right? So after supporting heavy customer acquisition cost, they spent a lot of money that went into the referrals. They actually got the customers, but now those customers staying, they're retaining, and they're bringing in more customers. So you see, it has to be actually be sustainable. This has to be sustainable. That's what the numbers are showing, right? So if you look at the graph, it says cumulated profit for Uber modulo fixed costs. If the customer is acquired through referral, Uber loses 16.6 euros on the first ride because of the referral fees. Right? So every time a customer is actually coming in because of referral, they are paying the customer who referred it to them some money, and obviously the customer who referred them is actually giving a code to the new guy, the new person, the new rider, and they're getting a discount, which means that essentially Uber is losing money because they're still paying the same amount to the driver. So that's a loss of 16.6 euros. Over time, the number of rides taken, this drop, this loss, it starts reducing. So from 16.6, it becomes 13.2, then 9.8 after the third ride, and after the fourth ride, it's over 6.4 euros, and after the fifth ride, it's only 3 euros. And then after the sixth onwards, it actually starts generating profit. So you see, the more a particular customer is retained, the more profitable they become. But the point is that in the beginning, Uber is willing to lose money to actually gain a long-term investment. That's what they've been trying to say about market shares. That's what I've been trying to say about market share being more important than revenue in the beginning. That's what they've been talking about creating the first settler advantage, about making sure that you have liquidity instead of actually focusing on the earlier profits. Earlier profits are a bad idea because that's a short-term benefit. You're not looking at the long-term, because this is a service-oriented thing. This is a platform-based thing. The longer they stay, the more they use, the more they'll attract, the more this goes in a long-term investment. So the example of a customer profit and loss, that's example right there. A referral fee of about 10 euros into 2, that's 20 euros. So average profit per fare is about 20% goes into commissions, multiplied by 17 euros per average fare, that's 3.4 euros right there. So number of fares before the profitability happens is over 5. So 5 different rides will happen by that same customer until after which they actually truly become profitable for you. But again, That's because Uber is looking at the long term, not at the short term. So, again, another very important aspect that I've been saying on and on again multiple times: sell the idea, not the product. Uber has been successful because of this low cost guerrilla marketing campaign. We remember we used to study about this guerrilla marketing attitude, this approach where you use these different kind of tactics, this less traditional tactics to actually promote your projects and promote your products. We used to study that in principles of marketing. This is a living example of it right there. Instead of wasting their time with TV spots and newspapers and magazines and radio ads, they're focusing on social media to spread it. They're focusing on good experiences and word of mouth, electronic word of mouth to spread it. And the idea anything in 5 minutes is what they're trying to focus on. So they give customers a story to tell, to create this virality, this viral approach to it, this viral marketing approach to it. So for instance, they also launched a particular project called Uber ice cream campaigns. The idea was that they would actually, you would tap a button and they would come running to you and give you an ice cream for free. They did this on the 24th of July 2014, and they did this in 252 cities across 57 countries, and they invited users to actually share in this entire thing. And how do they do it? This stunt was repeated in the form of Uber puppies, where they actually did it with dogs, small little puppies. They were given to you. I mean, you were obviously paying for it, but they'll actually bring them to you. And Uber mariachi are basically these big hatted guys who actually sing with banjos. It's a Mexican music form, so you'd call them and they'll come up to you and they'll sing this really good songs. Uber chopper, which was of course their helicopter service, and many others. They did this just to give you the idea, just to give you the perception that Uber is capable of doing something like this in just like that. Just in 5 minutes, you can have any of this. So 92% increase in volume on social media happened just because of this kind of stuff. Because you give them something to talk about. People love talking about how a particular company has done a particular thing. 70 million users came across Uber's campaign. Because of these campaigns, 70 million more users joined into Uber's platform. 11% increase in organic signups in Poland. And by organic, that means people are searching it on their own and they're coming in instead of going through the ad campaign. That's a huge increase right there because of just a small little campaign of customer engagement and delight. Moving on. Another very important aspect that a lot of companies and a lot of tech companies seem to fail at is that you need to keep your user interface consistent, because you need to understand that these companies don't have a physical presence. Think about it. Every time you go to a particular bank, almost all of them have the same feel. Ahan Labs all have the same feel. You can walk into one of them, walk into any of them. They're exactly the same. Why? Same goes for Walmart, Carrefour, Hyperstar, 7-Eleven, all of them. They all have this consistency so that you feel at home. You don't need to go around looking. The layout, the structure, it's supposed to be familiar. Localized, change according to your taste, but familiar. This is something that they've done. So even if it adapts to the local demand, Uber has made sure that the interface and the overall experience that you have with the app remains the same. So no matter which city you go to, which country you go to, you will be comfortable in using Uber. You wouldn't be like, oh my God, how am I going to use this in New York? I'm going to use it in the same way. This is very prevalent in the way that Google runs its entire ecosystem, or how Apple runs its ecosystem, or how Amazon does it. No matter which Amazon's regional site you go to, it is exactly the same. You go to amazon.jp, you go to amazon.co.uk, you go to amazon.in, you go to amazon.au.de, you get the picture. It's exactly the same. So as a result, 20% of Uber riders have actually taken Uber rides in other cities as well, because they feel very comfortable. We're on slide number 41, by the way. So leveraging others' networks to grow. Another thing, Uber's future customers are probably someone's current customers. And in order to acquire them into their businesses, Uber has opened up its set of APIs, which are, again, application programming interfaces, so that these third-party apps can actually use Uber's apps. So what it does is, Uber has actually talked to its API users, the developers, and said, "Yaar, aisa kya kare? You should mention when you're emailing your users that their apps can actually work with Uber's apps, and you can actually use Uber." So Uber's APIs allow these developers to incorporate Uber into their applications, and there are over 10,000 such apps at the end of 2015. So developers can make up to $5,000 in referral fees. So every time someone uses a separate app, let's say there's several such apps, American Airlines, there's Trip Advisor, there's TripDub, there's a lot of similar apps that actually people use to plan their trips. And if someone uses them and those apps refer to Uber for your taxi services to move from point A to point B, And if the customer actually agrees, these owners actually get $5 per user as referral fee, as commission. Again, this gives them the incentive. This is again a new, this is basically using someone else's platforms. This is basically leveraging their platforms to actually get more customers, and in return you're paying them. But remember, Uber will lose money, yes, with the referral fee. Long term benefits, people, long term benefits. That's what they're focusing on. So the partner program is aimed at big companies that integrated Uber in their own app. That's the partner network, and it's a free added service for their customers, and it's offers this extra exposure to Uber. It gives them another place to promote themselves, to gain new customers. Now, number four, mutating fast. Now, once you've actually created the contagion effect, you need to mutate fast. You need to adapt. You need to change. Every single virus in known to man, biological viruses, they are capable of changing themselves. Otherwise, they would just die out. I mean, we will make antiviruses, antiviral medicines that would kill them. So similarly, and since we're taking the same analogy, Uber needs to mutate, it needs to change. So if you do not actually continue to innovate, you do not try and control the, strengthen your market and enlarge it, and destroy your competition, they'll destroy you in return. How does Uber do it? Let's look at it. So Uber has been evolving. Uber's evolving vision is simple: perpetual mutation. It's not about doing it once or twice. It's about constantly doing it. So in less than 6 years, Uber's mission statement has changed twice. Remember, the vision is still the same. The mission statement has changed twice, highlighting the major mutations of Uber's model and vision. So let's look at it. In 2010, the mission statement was, in 10 and in 12, it was everyone's private driver. So the new Uber services that started in 2010 was Uber Black and Uber SUV, which were these black sedans and these SUVs that they were launching. And it changed to Uber X in 2012, where you had not just black sedans, but a lot of other cars. And then if you were to look at the shifts in the model, in the beginning there was none, and then it shifted to everyone can become an Uber driver. Earlier they used to hire people, then they opened up and allowed a lot of other people to become drivers. The core goal in the beginning was simple. There wasn't really per se a goal, but later on the core goal focused on increasing the offer and decreasing the price while increasing demand. Try and get the exponential growth starting. And the key metrics in the beginning was nothing, because it was just experimental. In 2012, however, it became that Uber X drivers are 6 times more numerous than Uber Black drivers. It already changed. I mean, if you look at it, in the beginning, they just had their own drivers. Eventually, because when they shifted their focus into becoming not just everyone's private driver, but also everyone's private driver, where everyone else could be a driver of Uber to be everyone else's private driver. Therefore, the number of Uber's regular drivers increased 6 times more than the ones that they actually hired, because obviously they similar to, take the same analogy. Google or Apple doesn't make every single app on their app store, but there are millions of apps there, because they've created the structure, they've created the infrastructure, the network, where a lot of app developers come in and make apps for them. So that's many times more, the number of apps that they themselves actually create. So others do it, but they've given them the platform. Similarly, Uber did the same thing. In 2014, however, their mission statement changed. From becoming an everyone's private driver, they became a transportation as reliable as running water. So they've shifted it. They made Uber Eats, they made Uber Rush, they made Uber Pool, they made Uber Commute. Uber Pool and Commute basically was interesting, in the sense that Uber Pool was about making sure that a lot of people who are all going to the same place would, instead of taking separate cars from Uber, would share their cars. That would save on fuel costs as well as the fare costs. And Uber Commute was another service that people would use for those who would be going from point A to point B every single day. So it'll be cheaper for them if they were to use Uber Commute instead of Uber X, which is the name for their regular car service. So, and another shift in their model from 2014 was that they opened to goods delivery. Instead of just people delivering, people being delivered from one place to another, they started actually delivering goods, where Uber became a transportation company instead of just a taxi company. And then they also included shared rides and more people in fewer cars in 2014. Further on through Uber Pool and Uber Commute. So Uber Eats was about delivering food items. Uber Rush was about, similar to like TCS Hazard does now. TCS Hazard is essentially, simulating and emulating the model of Uber Rush. So minimizing drivers' idle time was their core goal in 2014, and making sure that they have more revenue coming in from other places. And further on, down to 2014 and 15, the decrease in price and increase in demand and increase in offer was their focus. So compare this to earlier on. They were doing the same, only now their focus has changed, because now they're also focusing on decreasing the price and increasing the demand, increasing the offers, increasing the variety of offers after they started Uber Pool and Uber Commute. So Uber Eats is already available in over 16 cities. In San Francisco, Uber Pool represents 50% of total rides. So Uber Pool was focused more on those countries where there is a lot of people moving from one place to another. Say, for instance, this could probably work really well in Karachi. I mean, there's a lot of people who go and work at IH Chandigarh Road. So this would be, and a lot of people who work in Southern. So this could work really well for us. In 2016, instead of just talking about being transportation network, they said moving bits and atoms. In other words, they started talking about moving a lot of data as well. So Uber Trip Experiences and Uber Offers was their new services. Uber Trip was like going to different places, and Uber Offers was again different holiday places and stuff. And the shifts in the model that they had was monetizing captive user attention and aiming for the perpetual ride. The idea being that you would start focusing on making more money off of users that would take the longer rides, longer routes, maybe outside the cities and also, and new revenue streams that they're currently focusing on. So you see, notice that how they've changed, how they're willing to change substantially and come up with new business models. This is usually the case with successful companies. They would always make a shift, they would always focus on newer stuff and newer things, because if you're going to stay stagnant, you will be swallowed up by the competition. So moving to the next slide, this is slide 44 now. Starting the network, a black car service. Now I'm just going to talk about a little bit about the background. So Uber Cab was founded in 2009. They started operating its black cars in 2010 in San Francisco. It only had professional drivers that they hired. They were only drove black sedans. There was no booking fees, but obviously you had to order through the app, and it was pretty expensive. Actually, more expensive than a taxi back in the day, because it was meant to be a premium service and experience. Uber then later started challenging the taxi service and the black car market. And by black car, I don't mean illegal cars. By here, it means black cars usually synonymous with actually exclusive service cars. So it from becoming just an exclusive service car, it then eventually started becoming a taxi service. So it says, by providing a simple service, a ride at a button, and a perfect user experience, that was the beginning of Uber's value proposition. That's where it starts. So Uber Cab became Uber, just Uber in 2011, and launched Uber Black and Uber SUV with an identical value proposition that you can actually get these premium cars, wherever and whenever and how, for whatever purpose, moving from A to B. Later, it launched Uber Van for large number of passengers. I mean, it's not like you could have just 4 or 5 people. You could, if you've got about 50 people going from one place to another, you could get Uber Van. So on-demand car service is what they started with. So this was the starting. Then they turning the network. They letting more drivers in. This is what they did. This is what I was talking about. It says in 2012, Uber launched Uber X, or Uber Pop as it was called in Europe, where a lot of taxi ride sharing hybrid kind of started, registering as transportation network company and getting best from both sides. So non-professional drivers also started joining in, who would just come up with their own cars, and they would say, we will pay for the fuel, and they would be part of Uber's network. And it became a new source of income for anyone who was willing to drive. So if you're willing to drive, if you're enjoying to drive, you just drive people around. So lower prices for riders, because obviously now that we have a huge supply of drivers, the prices could be reduced for each of the riders when they actually wanted to move from point A to point B. Same experience as Uber Black. I mean, Uber Black was an exclusive service, but now that we had good cars that people were willing to contribute to the service, it's basically crowdsourcing. Think about it. It's crowdsourcing, where people are coming up with their cars, fueling it themselves, and they're going to be part of Uber's network, and they are going to give away 20% of the 100% that they make and keep the 80% for themselves. It's that simple. So by tapping into these privately owned excess capacities, the people had their cars, just sitting around. So why not use them? So Uber has been able to exponentially grow its pool of drivers that it couldn't have. And you would think, now that we have more drivers, it will cost you more. No, it costs them less now that they have a huge supply. So before launching Uber X, the number of Uber drivers had a steady but slow growth. But after Uber X, they had a tremendous growth. So making the supply explode. So if you look at the numbers in July 2012, there were practically none. In July 2013 and onwards, Uber Black, they had some good numbers. It's when they actually started the Uber X service, that it exponentially grew to over 150,000 drivers. So there are 6 times more Uber X drivers than Uber Black drivers in US, which makes perfect sense. So turning the network, getting more people into fewer cars. This is what I was talking about when I said Uber Pool. It enables people to share a ride and split the cost with other users who are also taking the ride to the same route, to the same place, and the users can pay up to 50% less. So imagine that if you're going to IH Chandigarh, someone else is also going close by, maybe to Sadar, maybe to Shine Complex, you obviously save some cost right there. Think about it. You pool the car. Instead of taking two different cars, you go in that car. Instead of paying the full fare, you pay 50% of the fare. The other person pay 50%. There you go. So driver gets 2 to 3 rides for the cost and time of just one. So you actually get 2 to 3 people riders, taking you, and Uber takes a higher 35% fee. So they charge a little more for this, right? So this is the diagram clearly shows that lesser cars on the road too. So this would probably work really well for a lot of cities and countries where the regulation requires Uber to not have so many cars and not increase the number of cars on the road. So optimizing further excess capacity and an increase in car utilization and a decrease in price and drivers idle time also happened by when Uber actually created Uber Commute. This was a version of Uber Pool that was dedicated to taking people to work. So this was launched in 3 major markets: the US, China, and India. And I'm pretty sure they're going to launch this very soon in Pakistan as well, because it makes perfect sense. So 50% of Uber rides in San Francisco are Uber Pool rides, while 30 million Uber Pool rides happen every month in China alone. 95% of the trips could be shared if riders were willing to wait an additional 5 minutes, just 5 more minutes for other passengers. You would actually get all shared rides, which means they'll charge you lesser. Right, and that would be in the case of 95% of the trips. 1 million cars could be taken off from London's roads, according to Travis Kalanick, thanks to Uber Pool. So you can take away a lot of these extra cars. That's what I was talking about. This will reduce pollution, this will reduce noise, but this will reduce traffic. And again, this would help you get to your place faster, which in the long run is a good thing for the rider and the drivers. But the riders won't have to wait that long. The drivers will get a new ride very quickly. So turning the network from premium to low cost. Again, in 2015, when Uber launched Smart Routes and HOP, these services are designed for price-sensitive customers who are willing to sacrifice time. They're willing to wait a little longer to actually, get to their place. So users request Uber Hop rides. In this case, you're actually waiting somewhere, and let's say someone else is riding from point A to point B, and obviously they've consented to it. So users will then say where they want to join in, and they would then share it, their ride to a predefined destination. Now, this would require, of course, that you're willing to wait, because that a car would go by your route from where you're standing. And if you wait a little while, you would be able to actually hop on to one of these cars, right? The other rider will, of course, consent to this. Otherwise, this won't happen. So this is another thing that if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of time, and you would save some money. So Uber Smart Route is an extension of Uber Pool, and it actually offers fare reductions automatically, because if the customers are picked up by a near smart route, a car going by on the same route, you're saving money. So by providing incentives for customers, to rally precise pickup points, Uber is able to maximize how many people are taking a single car, and therefore again lower the prices. So Uber Hop is currently in a pilot stage in Seattle in US, and smart routes only exist in San Francisco. Okay, so once this becomes more popular, once they have more real-time data, they would probably start making this happen in other cities as well. Why San Francisco? Because tech capital and all. So that's why. Extending the network from transportation to logistics. Now, this is all nice and good, but again, as we said, Uber is expanding into other areas. So in 2014-15, Uber started doing Uber Eats and Uber Rush, respectively, which is basically their meal delivery service for restaurants and delivery service for businesses. So Uber Eats is for restaurants. It's like, think of it as Eataway and Food Panda, where they would actually deliver food from places, from different restaurants. And for Uber Rush is basically for delivery of packages like TCS Hazard. So Uber Eats is embedded in Uber app. You can actually do that in several cities where it's available. So Uber Rush is accessible to businesses through a dedicated API. So Uber Rush is only focused, different from Hazard in the sense that it only focuses on businesses. Now, imagine they make a lot of sense if they were to launch in Pakistan as well. They would probably be in direct competition with Food Panda, at least with the case of Uber Eats. So both services leverage Uber's existing networks. I mean, it's already there. Think about it. You don't need to do anything new. Uber doesn't need to do anything new at all. The apps are already there. Drivers are already there. The cars are already available, and people are already using it. So all they really need to do is to decrease the idle time a lot of other drivers and just exploit the capacity further. So Uber leverages direct access to users through the app and actually gives them another opportunity. Uber Rush, you want some food, they'll bring it up for you from whatever restaurant you want. So Uber Rush is currently live in San Francisco, New York City, and Chicago since 2014, while Uber Eats has launched in 15 North American cities, as well as in London, Melbourne, Paris, and Singapore. Again, they're focusing on first world countries and cities, and then slowly and gradually they'll trickle down. But you can see that this would probably make sense. And again, they don't need to put in any extra effort. Maybe, of course, the cars and the drivers are going to be specific for it. You'll probably need some temperature controlled cars and temperature controlled equipment, but that's about it. The infrastructure is already in place, the system's already in place, the consumers and the customers are already in place. So if that's what Travis Kalanick said. He said, if we can get you a car in 5 minutes, we could practically get you anything in 5 minutes. Think about it. If a car can approach you from one point to another, we could do anything with the rest. So moving on, this is what I was talking about when I said scalability and diversification. So economies of scale helping economies of scope, right there, with one goal in mind, which is moving away from car ownership. Uber's ambition has been to make sure that they substitute your car ownership. The idea is that they want less people to be owning cars just to move around. They want people to use Uber instead. So Uber cuts prices 5 to 6 times in a 2-year period to make its services even more appealing to customers and turn away. So people who own cars, once they start using Uber's focus is to try and convince them that owning a car would be more expensive than using them. So the average US household owns about 2.1 cars, with 20% owning 3 or more cars. Uber's idea is that we want to make that less people would own cars. So price from 1162 Pacific Street to 55 Washington Street in New York City. This is a comparison of prices. So we don't know these addresses, but just to get the price comparison. So Uber Black would have cost you $30, $32. Taxi would cost you about $21, $22. Uber X would cost you just about $12, $13. Uber Pool would cost you about $6 to $7. And Subway itself would cost you about $2, $3. So the magic's right there. I mean, it makes sense, right? That's what Travis Kalanick says. So the magic is there. You basically bring the cost below the cost of ownership. If you can bring the cost of traveling every day using Uber services less than the cost of actually owning a car and then using the car every day, then obviously people won't want to own that many cars. So the math makes sense. I mean, there's an example of Megan Quinn who worked for a venture capitalist, KPCB, and she said that she sold away her car because she realized that moving around with Uber was cheaper actually and was below the cost of actually owning a car. So there's a comparison. Again, those numbers may not add up for our country, and maybe probably it makes sense to own a car in our country, but at least in the US they made sense. So cost of owning a car for a year is about $10,000. $10,281, which includes parking plus gas plus insurance plus maintenance plus tolls plus parking tickets and amortization cost of the car itself. While cost of riding with Uber for a year is about $4,655. So again, makes sense. The math does, at least in some cities and countries it will. So from network to becoming an industry leader. Now, this slide has something very interesting in this. It says the CEO of Box. By the way, Box is a company which is similar to Dropbox, similar to Google Drive. They're basically a cloud storage service provider. So the CEO of that company, Aaron Levy, says that if you were to, let me first quote him and then I'll explain it. It says, sizing the market for a disruptor based on an incumbent's market is like sizing the car industry off of how many horses there were in 1910. What he's essentially saying is, if you're looking at a new company that's making a new disruptive, innovative, change in that industry, and you're going to say, so this new company's market size that it can gain is probably the market size of the other one. The example that Aaron Levy, the CEO of Box, is giving here is, if cars are the new disruption, and you were to say, so the market that the cars can actually capture is basically equal to how many horses there were that were catering for this earlier, then you're dead wrong. You see, you need to understand that just because a particular new technology is replacing something doesn't mean that all it'll do is replace the market that was already there. No, you see, the disruption is going to gain more market. Think about how many people actually used to have telephones at home and how many cell phones we have today. Every one of us has at least two now, or at least one, and a lot of people have two, maybe even more. Recall how many radios people used to have, and see how many TVs we have today and how many computing devices we have today. And when I mean computer devices, I mean cell phones and laptops and desktops, tablets. You see, it'll increase. So the comparison's right there. 16 billion taxis and blacks, $16 billion in the taxi and black cars, industry, 26 billion in the car rental industry. One would say कि नहीं replace करेगा तो इतना तो नहीं होना चाहिए, लेकिन नहीं, ऐसा नहीं होता. You need to think that the market actually increases, more people come in. So last mile delivery, FedEx, UPS, $45 billion. So one would say okay, we would just combine them and that's the amount that Uber would make. No, Uber is going to make a lot more. Uber is going to gain a lot more market. So 64 billion of the urban public transport, the various New York City Metro service and the RTD. And then we have the US automobile market, the Toyotas, General Motors, Ford, and all that, for $570 billion. The US market size in billions. But that's not what happens. You see, from when it actually starts replacing it, that's not what it happens. Uber is no longer a cab company, it's a transportation network. It wants to do a lot of everything, and move everything and everyone from point A to B, whether it be equipment, whether it be people, whether it be food, everything. And it's trying to create a vision where Uber would replace all cars and won't be just a taxi market service. Uber's market is going to be much bigger than all of these markets together. You would probably think that this is going to be the market, but no, Uber's going to create new markets. Uber's going to bring in more kind of customers. So what's next for Uber? What's next is they'll be increasing the average revenue per car. What are they going to do with its new mission statement, which is moving bits and atoms? Uber is clearly ambitious to become more than just a transportation company. It wants to become a real infrastructure platform where they're going to give a lot of other services. So Uber is taking advantage of the direct contact it already has, and the attention it has of these passengers during Uber rides. So what's it going to do? Uber is going to be Uber is going to probably be actually be giving a lot of other service. For instance, media distribution channels. So Uber Trip Experiences allows users to connect to their favorite apps during the Uber drive. So they're going to give Wi-Fi and people can use those apps and they can communicate those apps with those apps. Uber gives brands an opportunity to use Uber riders' captive attention to give a lot of content, maybe TV shows, programs, music, during a Uber trip. Similarly, Uber offers how so customer acquisition channels. So Uber offer enables brands to push promotion ads that could be based on geolocation. Imagine you're using a cell phone through Uber experiences. You're passing through a particular place, and up pops an ad because the minute you crossed by, there was a sale going on a place that your Uber ride was crossing by, and you get an ad geolocated based on your cell phone's location right there and then. So that's what happens. They're giving an example of Starbucks. Imagine the same for a food place, so, a new burger shop or a pizza place. You immediately see that ad the minute you're passing by it. So that could be a nice way to reach local customers, a very, very cheap and very, very effective way to do so. So what's next after that? The next after that is perpetual ride, which is 24/7, 100% capacity being used. The ideal transportation effect. So imagine cars that would just never stop. A completely optimized system where the car just doesn't need to stop, where resources, the cars are used at 100% capacity. And you'll be like, huh? How is that even possible? The drivers need to eat, sleep, shit, they can't possibly be driving all the time. The cars need refueling. That is not possible. To fulfill this dream, Uber will have to reach a massive scale. You need to have a lot of cars, right? You need to have a lot of drivers so that, every car would change drivers, and then the cars would just, one car would stand and the other one would move on. So Uber will have to reach this massive scale to make sure that this high liquidity is constantly maintained. But can it really be done? Think about it. So Uber is making sure it's doing the Uber pooling thing quite a bit, where a lot of people share cars. Again, that will give them access capacity because the other cars can constantly be moving. They're doing this in China, in the US for drivers. In San Francisco, Uber has already reached a record of 8 non-stop Uber pool rides, non-stop of a single car, taking up to 8 rides and then only then stopping for rest and refueling. So we can imagine a perpetual trip. The driver picks up one customer, then picks up another, and drops one of them, and then picks up another without waiting at all, without waiting much. But that's what they're trying to do. So how will they do it? Think about it. I mean, practically think about it. The driver has to wait. The driver has to sleep. The driver has to rest and refueling. And that's where this interesting new thing comes up, right? This is slide 53. Think about it. This is creativity. You combine the idea of the autonomous car, the self-driving, driverless cars, and you combine it with Uber's extremely powerful, extremely well-optimized infrastructure that runs with apps. You don't need drivers. You need cars that can drive themselves. We already have it. The concept's already there. Google has already done it. And may I remind you that the largest investor in Uber is actually Google Incorporated. So How does it do it? So Uber plans to replace its fleet of drivers eventually with driverless cars as soon as the technology is perfectly ready. Now, driverless cars by Google are already moving around in Mountain View, California, which is where their headquarters is, and they're already being tested citywide there. And eventually, once they have already made a lot of partnerships with a lot of car companies, they will be launching across the globe eventually. So the expectation is that the rides would be cheaper because there'll be no drivers to pay, and there'll just be cars that are automated. So the revenue expectations will increase, and this perpetual ride dream right now is just to 8 trips, right, without stopping. Then it'll be, well, practically infinite. So opened Uber did, what Uber did to do this was they opened up a research center in Pittsburgh in 2015 to start building its own autonomous cars. It allegedly already pre-ordered about 100,000 Mercedes to start getting to install self-driving car kits in them. It recruited top researchers and executives from the car industry, especially Google's ex-vice president of engineering. They hired him, and they hold a strong advantage in the race in the autonomous car because they already have data about where and when people want to go and what they want to do and what they want to be driven in. So they already have that data. They have that plus point right there. So the reason Uber could be expensive is that you're paying for the other person in the car, right? And that's where the charges would drop. When there is no other dude in the car, the cost of taking an Uber anywhere is cheaper. That's what the CEO said, Travis Kalanick. So from virus to host, in other words, another disruptive strategy. So Uber is following a three-step plan to become the transportation infrastructure for our cities, becoming more and more infectious. The virus is slowly becoming the host itself. The virus is becoming the creature. How so? It controls the infrastructure. First, you infected the infrastructure. And again, this is an analogy. Please don't think of Uber as a virus. So first, the idea was it infects the cars with Uber Black. First, it starts with having these interesting new cars where people are driving them, driverless cars. Oh, sorry, the driver-based cars in the beginning where you pay an extra premium service and people are driving you where you want. Then it starts increasing it through Uber X and Uber Pool and several Uber Commute. Then eventually, once these driverless cars come in, all cars almost get replaced by it. So they build their own cars with autonomous vehicles. Interestingly, I need to add something else here. Now, Google has changed its driverless car project's name from Google Driverless Cars or Google Cars to Google Waymo. Now, interestingly, also they've started focusing on making sure that their technology is modular, that you could just install this driverless kit into any car, the device into any pre-built car, and actually have it become driverless. And you can see where this is going. They're probably doing this because they've already realized that the companies like Uber would love to get their hands on that kind of technology, so that Uber would just buy cars and just plug in the driverless technology into them. So then comes the defending part, which is the final and the most important part. Once you already have everything ready, you need to defend against a competitor. How does Uber do that? Uber is threatened from all sides. How so? Drivers. Most definitely, the drivers are the biggest threat themselves because they are practically keeping it running. So will they be able to continue to be there? Because obviously Uber won't be anything without its drivers, right? But they're already moving towards autonomous cars, and drivers are going to be scared about it, and they won't want that. So Uber has already grown to become the largest transportation giant ever in less than a decade, and they are already changing the rules. But they need to actually start focusing on a lot of things. Then come the car makers. There are lots of car makers who want to, who are scared because if Uber is talking about making sure that less people own cars, that's a bad thing for them, right? They want their cars to be sold, dude. So think about it. Uber hasn't made any car makers very happy with that statement when you say you want to move away from car ownership. So, but they have room left to reinvent themselves because of the challenge of Uber and to start focusing on similar ideas of self-driving cars. So Tesla already is focusing on self-driving cars. So is General Motors, Toyota, and Volvo with Google's project of Google driverless cars, or Google Waymo as it's called. Regulation all over the world. A lot of governments are threatening Uber's model. We've already seen a lot of protest videos on Facebook about how drivers in Portugal were actually screaming and shouting and protesting that they were being taxed like taxi drivers, while those who drove Uber taxis weren't actually being charged. And they were not, because by law they weren't actually considered employees of Uber, which is being challenged. So in several countries, Uber has either been under several has been under tremendous pressure from government bodies to actually start obeying the rules and start registering their drivers as their employees and pay more taxes, and in many cases have been outrightly been banned. So especially in the case of Middle East, but the other reason has been that they would prefer the people to use the public transport system. Now, the competitors, Uber already has a lot of competitors. It's not the only one who does this. There are lots of other places. There's Lyft, there's Ola, there's a lot of other services. Say, for instance, there's Careem in Pakistan, which actually has a better reputation than Uber in Pakistan. Now, and there are, of course, the tech giants, which are themselves a threat. There were the same ones that Uber actually created its entire business model based on. They themselves are threats. How so? Because they're constantly investing in the transportation business themselves. I already said that about Google. I already told you that about how Amazon's doing it with their logistics department. Facebook is doing it through their drones and is probably going to start focusing on it eventually, especially with their AI program. We don't really know much about Apple. From what I've heard, they haven't even bothered. Anyways, but they might. The rumors are that they might. Let's see. So this is now slide 57. So Uber versus the government, it's also a political fight. Why? Because we should have realized sooner that we are running a political campaign and the candidate is Uber, because the governments don't want to lose this out. The government gain a lot of money through the taxes, through the that come through taxis and through people buying cars and actually getting driving licenses and then riding their cars every day. So Uber is under pressure from governments. How so? With the creation of this transportation network company status, Uber has obviously, taken an unfair advantage that I just mentioned against taxi networks for, in many cases, for which, 1 million in cities like New York City. But now this regulation is becoming bad for them. So Uber actually adapts to comply with the law in Moscow. Uber just accepts professional drivers and shares data. That's already happened there. It only gets professional drivers in Moscow, so that they don't lose a job right there. They've retreated in several other cities where Uber services, as I said, have been banned. In this case, Uber obeys, like in Paris, where it ceased its Uber X activity, which was called Uber Pop. So you don't see Uber cars in Paris. I already told you about that too. In some cities like Austin, which is in Texas, Uber is not forbidden but retreats because policies prevent the liquidity. The policies are stricter, so they can't gain the critical mass that they wanted. And Uber has partnered in many places. For instance, in Hyderabad, in India, they've actually partnered with the government, and it has promised to train about 2,000 drivers. So they've talked to the government and they're now offering them as jobs. So they've invested $50 million there to create their headquarters and train more drivers and give better jobs to people as drivers. They've defended themselves in the case of in California, where a Californian judge requalified a driver as an employee. So I already said that, right? So as an employee, a similar judgment is awaited in France, a serious threat to Uber's economic model, because if they become employees, it would change. So in the US, Uber had to pay about $100 million to settle a similar class action suit with their drivers. So the drivers are now being declared as employees, which would give them a lot of benefits. A lot of countries have minimum wage rules and lots of other advantages that then Uber would be forced to give. So right now they're doing it voluntarily. They're giving some percentages. Later on, Uber will have to then bear their costs, which will obviously hurt their entire economic model and their revenue model. So they have paid in heavy fines in some places for and operational costs. So in some municipalities like Newark, not New York, Newark, they don't hesitate to make Uber pay to operate. So in $3 million upfront and in 10 million across 10 years to access the airport in the Newark airport. So in lobbying, in globally, Uber has been spending a lot of money in lobbying. So they've hired a lot of top smart people to handle their public affairs department. For instance, the names are Neelie Kroes, an ex-EU commissioner for competition, and even David Plouffe, the ex-director of Obama's campaign, to promote themselves, to lobby themselves so that they could have a better say with the government of various countries. So Uber's response has been an ideology war. Uber is not just focusing on strategy in this way. They've been trying to focus in how they present themselves. And Uber has created a divide in the public opinion in many cities where the support and the opposition to ride-sharing service has become intense. So they've created this phenomena where people are siding either with Uber or against it. It's like a political thing now. So in the culting of brands, Douglas Atkin, who's the vice president of community Airbnb, explains how brands can actually leverage these cult techniques to turn customers into true believers. And it seems Uber has learned that lesson well. Then this is interesting. In this particular book, it talks about how you could actually make branding so strong that people would believe thoroughly in it. You could take my own example. I love Android and Google to death. So that's exactly what they're talking about. So the transportation, industry, Uber's learned that. So the transportation genius has always been able to actually count on its users to do this. You will notice this already happening on Facebook, where people are arguing about which one's better, Uber or Kareem, and people are very adamant and very loyal to one or the other. So 4 steps to turn customers into believers. How do you do it? You determine a distinctive ideology. You start focusing yourself as a brand, and creating this perception in the customer's mind with regards to it. So, or you could either become this ultra liberal kind of hip kind of thing, which is your like a gig economy thing, or you could become a libertarian objectivist. For instance, in this case, that the CEO, Kalanick, is actually a big Ian Ren fan. Ian Ren is, by the way, an author who wrote a very influential book called The Fountainhead. If you get a chance to read it if you want to. It talks about the objectivism theory of life. Anyways, so again, another one would be another strategy to convince customers to become true believers into your idea is to declare it to the world. Marketing campaign where you talk to people and convince them to be Uber entrepreneurs. You convince them, okay, giving us your cars and actually being part of the system, you're actually an entrepreneur of sorts. Another one, another way is, of course, to demonize the enemy, the opponent, the rival, the competition, whether it be the government. You constantly call taxis as monopolies, as taxis as being evil, in the sense that they're charging you more, they're making more money off of you, and saying that these taxi services are basically the government's way of charging you more money and stuff like that. So Uber is obviously a good thing. I mean, because that's what they're focusing on. If you look at it, there's examples of a tweet right there which says Uber is obviously a good thing, that you can measure how corrupt cities are by how hard they're trying to suppress. So see, they're trying to actually gain sympathies from people in the way that they're saying that look at how government are trying to push us down. We are like the underdogs. We are trying to give you better transportation services while governments don't want this. This is like a for the people model. People are getting good jobs. You can earn good money, and the government doesn't want that stuff like that. So even launched petitions to convince people to do the same. So now we're on slide number 60, drivers mutiny. Mutiny, by the way, means rebellion. So if you refuse to meet and discuss with us, protests and strikes are only going to intensify nationally and globally as we continue to coordinate with driver groups around the globe. This is what Uber's drivers network said in an open letter to Uber. So they're saying, okay, if you don't talk to us, that's what the drivers were saying together. If you don't talk to us, we would actually start coordinating and making a lot of fracas, which is what they did. They actually did do that. I would highly recommend that you go and look at on YouTube for videos where you will see similar videos of people protesting and drivers protesting against Uber and their practices. So Uber's Achilles heels is the drivers. This is exactly why they're focusing on those self-driving cars. Uber knows that their weakness and their greatest strength is the drivers. So the lower prices and pickup times depend on the high supply of drivers. Steal its drivers away, and Uber would just collapse. It would just fall apart. So under a lot of pressure from these governments to actually, to follow the policies, Uber is now challenged from the inside by its own partner drivers, because now the drivers want more rights. The drivers actually want more power, more control. And until the self-driving cars and the driverless cars come in, this is the greatest challenge for Uber, to actually control the drivers without losing its huge supply. So Uber forgot it's a network of drivers and not a network of cars. Yes, that's a mistake that Uber made. They thought they've already reached that point, but they haven't. They're actually just a network of car drivers. So by trying to please riders with lower prices, which was fine, they forgot that if you do that, that means you're actually letting the drivers make less money. And the less money they make, the more problematic it becomes to retain them. So all around the world, they have protested against these price cuts. They're also unionizing together under the Uber drivers network to speak commonly together against how Uber is using them. So it's in a two-sided market. It's a risky move to sacrifice one side to please the other. It makes perfect sense. You can't sacrifice the drivers because they're practically your suppliers. So if just by lowering the fare costs, you're actually hurting the drivers, and the drivers are your real strength, so they will hurt you back. That's what they did. So again, Uber can be challenged by anyone with a large amount of funding and pro-driver strategies. So emerging actors like Get and Juno are taking on Uber by developing driver-friendly value propositions. So these are, competitions who are focused more on the drivers. So they Get uh, offers fair guarantees to drivers, and Juno only takes 10% of the commission as opposed to 20% taken by Uber. So and reserves only 50% of its founding shares to drivers. So startups like Arcade City leverage the blockchain to organize a network of driver commissions. reach 0%. Okay, so again, that's another example that organizes the network drivers and even takes up to 0% of commissions. Huge difference as opposed to 20% by Uber again. So in a market with supply side network effects, and this is a market with supply side network effects, it's the drivers that actually create the network effects. If the competitors attract your supply, the demand will automatically follow. So if you lose the drivers, people will move away from you because the drivers, because it's the supply side, side network effect. It is the supply that is keeping this network alive. It's the chicken before the egg, and the egg here is the rider, not the driver. Now, it's a never-ending competitive cycle. So Uber made on-demand cars mainstream and changed the face of transportation forever. Pure players, car makers, and tech giants are now in the race to conquer this market, questioning fundamentals of their own model. So if you live in a city, you don't need to own a car. That's what the executive chairman of Ford Motors Car Company said. His name is William Clay Ford Jr. So he said that. So it's a never-ending competition cycle. So it means Ford is already jumping into this, and they're already coming into this now. Now this is Uber and all. This is Uber, and by the way, Uber is a German word for mean superb, super, right? So this is Uber and everything. What happens if I want to compete with Uber? How do I do that? There are four strategies. Again, this is similar vein to how it was discussed in the Gaffinomics case study. So in 7 years, Uber has conquered the world. Will it be able to keep its position of power? Let's look at that. So legacy actors and pure players are trying to challenge it. How so? So there are four strategies. You either plug in, you connect to the existing networks, which is easy to do and but has limited value. You create your own networks, which means you compete head on. It's pretty hard to do, and it has limited value. Or you could partner with the already existing networks, which is will be easy to do and will have a lot of high value, like Uber itself did that. And or you could go the hardest out of all, which is differentiate, which will give you a lot of high value but will be very hard to do. So let's look at each one of them. So plug in, linking up with the virus. So you could plug in and then you can work with Uber. Sometimes just leveraging this disruptive virus assets might bring more value than fighting it. So it would perhaps be a better idea, instead of fighting head on with it, you just partner with them, work with them. So transportation is already becoming a very crowded market with a lot of disruptors coming in, adding another layer to the existing infrastructure. So if plugging in with Uber, the transportation networks can actually extend their reach and actually gain more flexibility, and they could solve the last mile problem by serving those areas which are not being served right now. For instance, in Paris, around 40% of Uber trips happen before or after public transportation trips. So people actually use the subway or the metro, and then they get off and then they take an Uber to go somewhere else. So integrating with the mass transit system would be pretty good for Uber. It would be very interesting. So one of those is Caltrain, and Caltrain and Uber have partnered in San Francisco, and obviously Caltrain stands for California Train. And what happens is that it's extended the reach of Caltrain network by providing Uber pool rides to and from South Bay Station. So for special events, Uber can actually bring the flexibility to the public transport system and the transit system. They can connect with it. So they'll give you a whole trip. You can use Uber pool to go from one place to another to the station, and from there with the public transport system. Similarly, United Airlines is plugging in to improve customer experience. So United Airlines integrated with the Uber's option into its own app. So if you were to fly somewhere, and by bringing this additional service, what you do is you actually fly to some other place, and then from there on use Uber. So again, that's they've plugged into Uber. And United is already differentiating itself from other airlines. So instead of actually going there waiting for the taxi at the airport, you just take an Uber, and you've already planned it. As soon as you actually bought the ticket, you planned for it already. So that's linking up with the virus. Then competing head on. So Uber could also do so by competing head on, and there are lots of companies who are actually fighting against, going head on directly with Uber. So because of its multi-local inherent structure, Uber has to fight hard against those local actors and fight against them, and so that they can operate. And it tries to either conquer them or usually operates in a duopoly where both actors are spending a lot of money to survive. That's what's happening in Pakistan, right? So a virtually infinite fight. So you've got Lyft in the United States, which was launched in 2012. So it still exists. Its valuation is about 5.5 billion. In Brazil, there's Easy Taxi, which does the same thing. In France, there's Chauffeur Prive, which was launched in 2012, and the valuation is about 25 million euros. In China, there's Didi, which was launched in 2012. Again, valuation 25 billion. In India, there's Ola, which was launched in 2011, valuation $5 billion. In Malaysia, it's Grab, and launched in 2012, valuation of 1.6 billion. In Pakistan, obviously, there's Kareem, but I don't have the valuation numbers. But you can see that these are the companies that are fighting head on. Either they were already in place before Uber came into their countries or came in afterwards. But these are all competing head on with Uber. Differentiating, that's another one. So various on-demand transportation models. So you could even differentiate. You could come up with a completely different model. You can go and compete in a market where Uber is not there yet. So beat a disruptive virus infecting your industry, and you can do that by differentiating. So Uber's most dangerous competitors might win the transportation war by just leveraging a differentiation value proposition. They'll come up and do something else. So pure players, of course, are in the race, but it's the legacy actors as well. Pure players are these new players, right? The new ones using tech industry like Uber did. Yeah, but there are also other older companies like General Motors. They created the Maven, and Ford created the Ford Smart Mobility as independent entities to focus on mobility services like hourly car rental. So they've started creating their own car rental services. So value, the models are like, for instance, the value proposition, taxi like a car and a driver at the tap of a button. That's the basic value proposition, right? Ride share, they already have it. So basically, let's look at this table. Let's compare the first one, taxi like services. That's the first model, right? The value proposition is a car and a driver at the tap of a button. And who are doing it? Uber is doing it, Didi is doing it, Lyft is doing it, Ola is doing it. Distance short, obviously. Sets destination is by the rider, sets price by the company. Owner of the car is actually the driver with excess capacity, obviously, and the business model is commission based. You see. And then there we have rider share, ride share. So again, we have I have room in my car, who wants to join in? That's the basic value proposition, right? And who is doing it? Waze rider, which is again a service by Google. There's blah blah car, that's already doing it. There's distance, is usually medium to long. Who sets the destination? In this case, the driver does. Who sets the price? The car owner does. Who owns the car? The driver. Again, this is also commission based. Hourly car rental services. Get access to our cars anywhere in the city. This is simple enough. You get a car, then you can drive it wherever you want. Maven by General Motors, Reach Now by BMW, and Zipcar and Autolib, and as mentioned earlier, Ford Smart Mobility. So who sets the destination? Now the car is obviously rented by the rider, so they decided. Who sets the price of the car rental service? The company does. Who owns the car? The company owns the car, and the business model is subscription based. You pay by the hour or by the day. The car share model, rent a car from other users. So this is like a mixture of the Uber service and the car rental service. So you actually get a car rented that is actually owned by somebody else, you know, instead of a company. So you rent a car from other users. So who is using it? Turo is doing it, Drivi is doing it. The medium to long distances are covered. The destination is set by the rider again. The car owner sets the price. The other users are obviously the excess capacity. They're the ones giving you the cars, and it's a commission based model. So you got several different on demand transportation models. You could focus on any of them or a combination of any of them. So another possibility is to partner, share assets and knowledge with the virus. You could work with them and share some assets. You can partner with them. So how do you do that? Partnering with a disruptive virus. This is different for plugging in. While plugging in is about using the network of Uber to actually, that's essentially plugging in is what Uber did when it created itself by plugging into Google and Google's network, right? Of using maps and their services. So partnering is basically you work with them side by side. So partnering with disruptive viruses might be a good strategy, because that way you can rise up and become a new innovative company yourself. So legacy actors are trying to join forces with Uber, old companies that do not have the same kind of disruptive technologies or ideas, so they want to partner with them. So a lot of partnerships have happened. Toyota and Uber have entered into a partnership, a strategic partnership, to explore the future of ride sharing, specifically Uber Pool and stuff, with the first brick being car leasing programs that they've already started for the car. So Uber buys cars from Toyota, gives them to drivers, and drivers then buy them off through the leasing process. Hertz and Uber have also entered into a partnership where they provide rental cars to Uber drivers, a smart way for Hertz to revive its business. Hertz is apparently a rental business that is being through a tough time these days. Fiat Chrysler and Uber is also in a partnership to create autonomous cars together. In some are investing in Uber's future, where Tata India is the automotive giant that has invested over $100 million in Uber. That's the first investment of Tata outside of India that they've done. So they want to support Uber, especially. And obviously, this is good for Uber because India is a very huge market. Google, back in 2013, Google's investment arm, Google Capital, invested over $258 million into Uber, a way to have control in the on-demand transportation market, plus a market for their autonomous cars as soon as they're able to build them. Microsoft also, gave away they work with Uber by giving their mapping services to it. So Microsoft invested over $100 million in this company. Okay. Then we, of course, have other examples. Competing frontally against a disruptive virus is nearly impossible. So what else would you do? You would form alliances, right? So this is what they did. So Didi in China, and Lyft in USA, Grab in Malaysia, and Ola in India partnered, and invested in each other's companies. They shared technology. So another way to actually fight them is to partner with each other. That's what this is. So if Uber falls in one of the opponent's markets, it could trigger its failure in the other markets. If success can spread like a virus, failure could too as well, right? So if they fail in one of these markets, they fail in the rest. Competitors are creating mobility alliances as well. What are they doing? General Motors invested about 500 million in Lyft to provide car rentals for drivers and build together network autonomous cars. So think about that. If Chrysler is working with Uber, then General Motors said, fine, we'll go work with Lyft. And the same vein, Apple invested $1 billion in Didi, right? And Uber's Chinese competitors, we already know them. And Chrysler is building minivans to help Google extend its test of autonomous cars. Now, while Chrysler is working for autonomous cars with Uber as well, they're also giving minivans to Google to work with theirs. So by bringing their fighting power together and harbor knowledge to Uber's direct competitors, I mean, one way is to partner with them, or you could just partner with the rivals of Uber. They're actually making interesting steps there. So this is how they're doing it for direct competition. Now, moving on, let's look at now. Here we go. So we can partner, or we could go head on. Then from phones to autonomous cars and eternal reputation. This is what it is. So the car will just be a big smartphone on wheels in the future. That's what the CEO of AT&T, Randall Stephenson said. So the autonomous car revolution is coming faster than we expected, and will reshuffle the cards in the on-demand transportation sector. The revolution looks a lot more like the previous than the smartphone revolution. Just the way that smartphones changed us, the self-driving car is going to change us. Apple and Google are the big winners of the smartphone revolution, having wiped out phone giants like BlackBerry and Nokia, and even Microsoft being given a resounding defeat by Apple and Google already. And they both have had a very unique strategy to reach this position of power. What would Uber become if applying the same recipe? And we already know the strategy that these two places applied. So four types of companies for one market. In the network world, four types of companies emerge in every market following the model set out by the smartphone revolution. So similar to the smartphone revolution, where these companies created the languages, the operating system, and then developers came in. Just because of that, just like that, the same thing's going to happen in the car industry. Let's look at the analogies now. Asset builders, these companies build, develop, and lease physical assets to make, market, distribute, and sell physicals. Then they will build the autonomous cars. Audi, Mercedes, Volvo, BMW, Tesla, Chrysler, Daimler, maybe Apple, right? Nissan, all of them, they build the assets same way the app developers develop the apps and the hardware as well. Actually, no, the analogy here with the asset builder will be the phone manufacturers. In Android's case, that would be the Samsung, the HTC, LG, Sony, Xiaomi, Oppo, several others, right? And in the technology creators, these companies develop and sell the intellectual property, the software, the analytics, the pharmaceuticals, the biotech. They will build the software that drives those autonomous cars. There's Google, there's Tesla, there's Audi, Daimler, Uber themselves, Baidu, all of them similar to in the cell phone industry as the app developers. They create the apps that actually run on the Play Store. Then there are the platform orchestrators. These companies create a network of peers in which the participants interact and share in value creation. That's the Google here. That they created the platform, the operating system where people actually come in, the development languages, the development platform. Similar to that, in the car industry, it would be Google who would create this for the autonomous cars. Uber themselves are trying to do it with other companies. Lyft is doing it. Baidu is doing it. Several other companies such as Microsoft is trying to do the same. They'll create the platform where people will be able to do this. Service providers, these companies will hire employees who provide services to customers or produce billable hours for which they charge. They will provide insurance, repairs, and cars. And obviously, extra things come up, just like in the cell phone industry, cell phone repair companies, the companies who make covers, the companies who make screen protectors, the companies who make off market chargers, the companies that create stickers for phone back covers, whatnot, all the accessory providers, accessory creators, the value added services. Again, in the in the car manufacturing, in the car and the transportation and the autonomous car industry, that's what who the other companies will be, like Solar City and other names that they put up here. It's very similar to how the cell phone revolution happened. So now we're going to look at Uber in its perspective, similar to the tech giants. First, Uber, in whether or not and how it's following Apple's footsteps. So Apple's strategy has always been that of vertical integration. It's a technology creator, right? An asset builder and a network orchestrator at the same time. We already looked at the definitions of each one of them. So they developed the iOS, they built iPhones with the iOS built in. So they're the only ones who create iPhones based on iOS. And they also operate the App Store, not create all the apps, but operate the App Store. So in that way, they are the technology creator and the asset builder and the network orchestrator. So if Uber follows Apple's strategy, it will develop their own autonomous cars and the operating system for those cars, and they will then create a network for those cars that will run around. This is probably a very risky move, as it will compete directly with car makers and with Apple itself. If Apple actually creates the cars, this would be very, very risky for them to do. But if they were to follow Apple's footsteps, that's a huge question mark. This is how they'll do it. What about Uber following Google's footsteps? How would they do it? Now, Google's strategy has been an open software strategy. We already know that it created the technology, it orchestrated the network, but it didn't build the assets. Google only recently created the Google Pixel phone. Even that, in that case, they actually got it designed and manufactured by HTC. So Google is different from Apple in that way, that they did not create the phones themselves. They created the technology behind the phones. They created the operating system. They created the Play Store. They created the development tools, the language, but not the assets. So how again? So they developed Android and they opened it to the phone makers. They created the smartphones. While the smartphones were built by different manufacturers, Samsung, HTC, and others, and Android was the operating system. But they did operate the Play Store. So how would Uber do it? So if Uber actually follows Google's strategy, it will develop autonomous cars themselves, the operating system, and then they will open it. Then they will let car makers build the car with Uber's operating system in it, and then Uber will actually naturally then orchestrate the cars for the car manufacturer. They'll dispatch them to the riders. So they won't create the cars, but they'll create the software for the cars. They'll connect they'll actually expect car makers to create those cars, and then they will give those cars to be sent to the riders so that they can pick them up and take a cut on the transaction. So essentially the same way that they're doing it right now, only difference is they'll be doing it with the self-driven cars, and only this time, since there are no drivers involved, they'll create the self-driving car operating system and run it. So probably the best strategy, if it can develop the operating system faster than Google can, and Google is already way ahead in this market. So if Uber will do it before Google, then this is the strategy that will make the most sense, because this is the kind of strategy that gave Google its huge market share right now. So one axiom: software is eating the world. That's what Mark Anderson said in Breaking Smart Season 1. Very interesting. Mark Anderson, by the way, almost always says something very interesting. So he says software is eating the world, and this is exactly what he means by it. So one certainty is that your industry will be eaten too. Software is eating industries one after the other. So young startups have been reinventing themselves with new business models, new value propositions, and they're conquering their entire industries one after another. So no industry is actually safe. Think about it. Accommodations, Airbnb; retail, Etsy; Amazon; media, Medium; YouTube; Facebook; energy, Nest, which is smart, appliances, connected to the Internet of Things; professional services, Upwork; LinkedIn now owned and acquired by Microsoft; telecom, WhatsApp; right? Entertainment, Spotify; Netflix is already available in Pakistan as well; travel, Booking.com; several other services; banking, TransferWise, and we already know another whole new avenue is Bitcoin and its popularity even in a country like Pakistan. So you see, every industry is changing because of the technological changes and the software based changes, and software is eating up industries, and you need to start focusing on that. We need to start changing ourselves in that way. So one strategy to do is to start thinking like a virus. So start thinking like the virus and do all those things that Uber has just demonstrated itself by doing. Which is, if we don't create the thing that kills us, someone else will. This is what Facebook's Little Red Book, which is their internal, company book that they use. It's a quote from that. It says, if we don't create the thing that kills us, someone else will. So you need to start focusing it and creating it yourselves. So five rules to act like a virus: synthesizes, identify a poorly served market, start serving it, develop a better platform, and keep serving it and making it better, and serve it 10 times better than what was already being done. So forget about capex. Networks are the new asset. It's not about capitalization. It's about making sure that the network is it's not about capital expenditure. It's about network asset becoming your asset. Seed the germs. Find the best environments that you can actually incubate your idea, and you can start creating your idea in. Do things that don't scale, that don't actually get increased, that would actually force you to change your network, they don't just scale up, they actually force you to change your network in a way so that you can actually incorporate that new scaling change. That's what you need to do, and forget about first mover advantage. Talk about the first settler advantage. Talk about liquidity. Talk about gaining the critical mass, the right kind of network effect. Number three, become contagious. Leverage your user base and make partnership to increase the virality. Okay, in spread like a virus. So you need to make more partnerships. You need to connect to more people so that you are more contagious like a virus. You'll spread. Forget about marketing. Users are your new media. The electronic word of mouth, the users' word of mouth is your should be your focus. That's your new marketing strategy. Create the right kind of experiences and they'll speak for you all the time. You remember what Mark Anderson again said, and what Jeff Bezos said, that if you actually please the customers, and he said that way back in 98, he said they will tell over 6,000 more people over the internet. They didn't realize it back then how important that statement is going to become, and that's exactly what has happened. So mutate fast. That's number four. Never stop innovating and pivoting to enlarge your market and annihilate competition. You need to keep on changing. So forget about cash cows. That's what I've been saying from the very beginning. That's something that I've been saying about Apple. They are going to start suffering because they're seeing the iPhone just as a cash cow, no innovation. So if you don't innovate, if you don't perpetually constantly change, you will actually be eaten up by your competition. The only way to success is to constantly change, constantly innovate, defend, protect your market against safeguards and competitors, or you will be replaced. So if you just forget about direct competition, don't compete directly, differentiate or partner up with what's left in the race. Either make something brand new. If all of you are going to just try and catch up with competition, that's a bad idea. Remember what was said in How Google Works by Eric Schmidt. They said the problem is that if every company starts thinking about countering the competition, what will happen is after a while everyone is just going to go move into one corner of the entire industry, and they'll all be doing the same thing, while some new entrant is going to come up with a brand new differentiated idea and change the entire game. That's what you need to understand. It's not about direct competition. It's about partnering and making a differentiated change so that you are still part of the race, so that you're still relevant. That's how you will defend your market. So that's pretty much it for Uber. I hope this will be helpful for you for understanding and for preparing for your exams. Thank you very much.